The Last Man Who Looked Lucy. Yen Vale in the Eye without permission lost 3 estates, a seat in Parliament, and his eldest daughter's engagement before the season ended. Nobody called it revenge. Lucien never used that word. He called it correction. The way a surgeon calls amputation a procedure. Clean, necessary, final. And if you think a man like that cannot be undone, stay until the end of this, because the thing that finally cracked the Duke of Blackthorne open was not a blade or a rebellion or the crown itself. It was a woman who walked into his fortress carrying nothing but bruises and a spine made of iron. And she did not kneel. Rain had not stopped falling on Northumbria for 11 days, the kind of rain that did not cleanse but punished. It hammered against the black stone walls of Blackthorne Castle like the fists of something ancient and furious, turning the courtyard into a lake of dark mud that swallowed boot heels whole. The servants had stopped complaining about it by the 3rd day. Complaining required energy, and energy at Blackthorne belonged exclusively to one man. Lucien Vale stood at the tall window of his private study on the east tower, watching the storm consume the cliffs below. He wore no coat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, exposing forearms lined with old scars he never explained, and his dark hair fell across his forehead in the careless way of a man who had stopped performing for anyone years ago. The candles behind him threw his shadow long and sharp across the stone floor, and the shadow looked more like him than his own reflection ever did. He was 28 years old. He had buried 2 rivals this year alone. Not in graves, in ruin. The first, Lord Ashworth, had attempted to bribe Lucien's steward for information about Blackthorne's shipping routes. Lucien responded by purchasing Ashworth's debts from every creditor in London within 72 hours, then called them all due on the same morning. Ashworth's wife found him weeping in his study at dawn, surrounded by letters of demand he could not answer. The family fled to the continent before the month ended. The second, a baronet named Fitzroy, had been foolish enough to spread rumors about Lucien's late mother at a dinner party. Lucien attended the next gathering Fitzroy hosted, said nothing the entire evening, and within a week Fitzroy's business partner had defected. His bank had frozen his accounts, and 3 newspapers published detailed accounts of his gambling debts. No fingerprints, no threats. Just the quiet machinery of a man who understood that power was not about volume. It was about pressure applied to the exact right fracture. The aristocracy feared Lucien Vale the way animals feared weather. Not because he was unpredictable, because he was inevitable. His steward, Morris, entered the study without knocking. Morris was the only man alive permitted that liberty, and only because Lucien had decided years ago that the sound of knocking irritated him more than the interruption itself. "The carriage from London has arrived, Your Grace." Lucien did not turn from the window. "How many?" "1 passenger, the lady, and a trunk." "1 trunk." Lucien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 1 trunk. The woman was arriving to live indefinitely in the household of the most powerful duke in England, and she had brought 1 trunk. Either she owned nothing else, or she wanted him to know she expected nothing from him. Both possibilities irritated him for different reasons. "Where is she?" "The entrance hall. Mrs. Blackwood is attending to her, but the lady has refused tea, refused the fire, and refused to sit." Lucien turned then, his eyes, a shade of gray so pale they looked nearly silver in the candlelight, fixed on Morris with the flat interest of a man cataloging data. "She refused to sit." "Yes, Your Grace, she is standing in the center of the hall, dripping on the marble. She looks—" Morris hesitated, choosing his words with the caution of a man handling something that might detonate. "She looks like she is waiting to be told whether she is a guest or a prisoner." "Neither," Lucien said. "She is a transaction." He said it without cruelty, without heat, the way a man states the price of grain or the distance between 2 cities. A fact. Lady Seraphina Ashcomb's brother had owed a staggering sum to men who operated in the shadow between finance and violence. When the brother could not pay, the debt transferred upward through the aristocratic food chain until it reached Lucien's desk. Not because Lucien was owed money directly, but because the men who were owed money owed favors to Lucien, and in the economy of power, debts were currency, and currency could purchase anything, including a marquis's daughter. The arrangement had been negotiated through lawyers and intermediaries over 6 weeks. Seraphina would reside at Blackthorne as a ward of the estate, a polite fiction that allowed the family to avoid the more humiliating alternatives. In exchange, Lucien absorbed the debts, and the brother retained his freedom. On paper, it was an act of generosity. Lucien had signed the documents with the mechanical efficiency of a man closing a minor acquisition. He had not thought about it since. Until now. He descended the east tower staircase slowly, each step precise, his boot heels striking stone with a rhythm that announced him before he arrived. This was deliberate. Lucien understood that anticipation was a weapon. The seconds before a powerful man entered a room were more effective than anything he might say once inside it. Let them hear him coming. Let them adjust their faces. The adjustments always revealed more than the faces themselves. The entrance hall of Blackthorne was built for intimidation. 40 feet of vaulted ceiling, black marble floors veined with gray that caught light like cracks in ice. Iron candelabras lined the walls, their flames guttering in the draft from the massive oak doors. Portraits of dead Vales stared down from gilded frames with the collective disapproval of men who had spent centuries accumulating land and grudges in equal measure. She was standing exactly where Morris described. Center of the hall, not near the fire, not near the door, not drifting toward any available comfort, which told Lucien she was either too proud or too exhausted to reach for one. Her cloak was black and soaked through, clinging to narrow shoulders with the heavy intimacy of wet fabric. Her hair, a deep auburn that probably burned copper in daylight, was slicked against her neck and jaw in dark ribbons. Water pooled on the marble around her boots. In a widening circle she made no effort to stop. She was thinner than he expected. The portrait her family's solicitor had provided showed a woman of healthy color and soft lines. This version of Serafina Ashcombe looked like someone had taken that portrait and slowly erased the softness with a rough hand, leaving behind something sharper. Her cheekbones were prominent, her collarbones visible above the neckline of a dress that had once been expensive and was now merely clean. And her eyes. Lucien stopped on the last stair. Her eyes were the problem. Dark brown, nearly black in the dim light, and utterly, terrifyingly steady. She watched him descend the way a wounded animal watches a predator approach. Not with fear, with calculation. Measuring distance, measuring speed, deciding whether to run or fight while revealing the decision to neither. Lucien had met kings and generals and men who controlled empires. None of them had ever looked at him the way this half-drowned woman was looking at him now, like she was deciding what he was worth. He reached the floor and stopped 6 feet from her, close enough to see the faint discoloration along her left jaw, a bruise days old, fading from purple into sick yellow. Close enough to see that her hands hung loose at her sides, but the tendons in her wrists were rigid, the way hands looked when they wanted to become fists but had been trained not to. Lady Serafina. Duke. Not your grace. Not my lord. Duke. The single word landed between them like a coin dropped on a counter. Take it or leave it. Morris coughed quietly near the doorway. Mrs. Blackwood, the head housekeeper, clutched a tea tray she had clearly prepared for a more cooperative arrival and stared at Serafina with the horrified fascination of a woman watching someone walk barefoot across broken glass. You refused the fire, Lucien said. I did. You are soaked through, you are shaking, and you refuse the fire. I am aware of my own condition, Duke. Are you going to list my symptoms until one of us dies of boredom, or are you going to tell me the rules? Silence, dense as the stone walls themselves. Morris stopped breathing. Mrs. Blackwood's teacup rattled faintly on its saucer. Lucien studied the woman standing in the widening pool of rainwater with the expression of a man examining a document written in an unexpected language. Not angry, not amused. Something more dangerous than both. Interested. Rules, he repeated. Every cage has rules. I would prefer to hear them now rather than learn them by punishment later. The word punishment hung in the air between them, and Lucien's gaze dropped, briefly and involuntarily, to the bruise on her jaw. When his eyes returned to hers, something had shifted in them, a degree of temperature. A fractional change in the chemistry of his attention, the way the air changes pressure before lightning arrives. This is not a cage, he said. Then what is it? My home. And what am I inside it? The question was surgical, Lucian recognized the technique because he used it himself. She was not asking for information. She was forcing him to define the terms in front of witnesses. Whatever he said next would be heard by Morris and Mrs. Blackwood and repeated through the servants' quarters before midnight. She was making him commit to a version of reality before he had time to construct the one that served him best. He had acquired her as a transaction. She was negotiating as an equal. And she was doing it while dripping on his floor with one bruised jaw and one trunk to her name. Lucian felt something crack beneath his sternum, a hairline fracture in something he had built to be unbreakable. "You are a guest," he said. "Guests can leave. Then you are a resident. Residents have rights. You will have chambers, clothing, food, access to the grounds, and a household account. You will not be touched. You will not be confined. You will not be sold, traded, or offered to anyone under any terms. What you will be is present, here, at Blackthorne, until the matter of your family's debts is fully resolved." Serafina absorbed this the way stone absorbs rain, slowly, without visible reaction, but taking everything in. "How long?" "That depends entirely on circumstances I do not intend to discuss in an entrance hall at 11 o'clock at night." For the first time, something almost like humor shifted behind her eyes. Almost. It appeared and vanished so quickly that a less attentive man would have missed it entirely. "Then I will take the fire now," she said. Lucien inclined his head, a fraction of an inch, the kind of acknowledgement he gave to people who had earned the faintest edge of his respect without yet earning anything more. "Mrs. Blackwood will show you to the east wing. Your rooms overlook the sea. If you require anything, Morris will attend to it." "I require nothing." "You will require many things, Lady Serafina. The trick is learning which ones to admit." She turned toward Mrs. Blackwood without responding, and Lucien watched her cross the marble floor with the rigid posture of a woman who had learned that the moment you relaxed was the moment someone struck. Her boots left wet prints across the stone that gleamed like dark footsteps leading away from something terrible. When the sound of her footsteps faded up the east staircase, Morris exhaled. "Your Grace." "Do not say it. I was merely going to observe. Whatever you observed, keep it inside your skull, or I will find a new steward." Morris, who had served the Vale family for 23 years and had survived 3 dukes, 2 political crises, and an incident involving a horse and a member of parliament that no one discussed, recognized the precise tenor of his employer's voice and wisely said nothing further. Lucien remained in the entrance hall long after the candles burned low. He stared at the wet footprints drying on the marble until they disappeared, and he could not explain, even to himself, why their vanishing felt like loss. 3 days passed before Lucien saw Serafina again. This was not accidental. Blackthorne Castle contained 47 rooms, 2 libraries, a chapel converted into a records office, and enough corridors to lose a man for hours if he did not know the building's logic. Lucien knew every inch. He could have found Serafina within minutes at any given time. The fact that he did not was deliberate, and the fact that he tracked her movements through Morris's reports without admitting to himself he was doing it was something he would have found humiliating if he had been capable of that particular emotion. She spent the first day in her chambers. Mrs. Blackwood reported that she ate half a meal, read 2 books from the shelf left in her room, and did not cry. The last detail was included because Mrs. Blackwood had apparently stationed herself outside Serafina's door at intervals throughout the night, listening for distress. She found none. This worried Mrs. Blackwood more than tears would have, a fact she communicated to Morris with the grim certainty of a woman who understood that silence in a damaged person was not peace, but architecture. The second day, Serafina explored. Morris's reports arrived at Lucien's study in clinical fragments. She walked the ground floor corridors for 2 hours without stopping or speaking to anyone. She found the smaller library on the south wing and removed 3 volumes on estate law. She stood at the window of the long gallery and studied the portraits of dead Vales with an expression Morris could only describe as diagnostic. She asked one question to the footman stationed near the kitchens. "Who maintains the ledgers for the household accounts?" The footman, terrified of answering incorrectly in a house where errors had consequences, directed her to Morris. She did not seek Morris out. She simply absorbed the information and moved on. By the third day, Lucien's irritation had compounded into something that functioned suspiciously like anticipation. He told himself he needed to establish protocols. He told himself the situation required management. He told himself several things that sounded like strategy and tasted like curiosity. And then he found her in the North Library at 7 in the morning, sitting in his chair. Not a chair. His chair. The leather wingback positioned beside the north window, where morning light fell at the precise angle Lucien preferred for reading. Every servant in Blackthorne knew that chair belonged to the Duke. It was not marked. It did not need to be. Power left its impression on objects the same way heat left its impression on wax. Serafina sat in it, with her legs folded beneath her, shoes discarded on the floor, reading a volume of estate law thick enough to serve as a weapon. She was wearing a dress from the wardrobe Mrs. Blackwood had assembled. Gray wool, simple, well made. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and without the rain and the darkness and the entrance hall theatrics, she looked younger than he had first estimated. 23, perhaps. Maybe less. She did not look up when he entered. Lucien stopped in the doorway. "You are in my chair." "Am I?" She turned a page. "The entire household knows that chair is mine. Then the entire household should have mentioned it when I asked where I might read." "No one told you?" The kitchen maid suggested the South Library. The footman suggested the garden room. Neither mentioned a forbidden chair in the North Library, which tells me either your staff is poorly trained or they were curious to see what would happen. Lucien considered this. She was correct on both counts, which irritated him further. He walked to the shelf opposite and selected a volume at random, a treatise on land reform he had already read twice, and settled into the smaller chair across from her. It was less comfortable. The light was wrong. He opened the book and did not read a single word for 20 minutes. She finished her chapter, closed the volume, and looked at him directly for the first time since the entrance hall. "You have been tracking me through your steward." It was not a question. Lucien met her gaze without flinching. "You are a new element in a controlled environment. Observation is standard procedure." Observation is what you call it when the subject does not know. When the subject knows, it is surveillance. And you object to surveillance. I object to dishonesty about its nature. The fireplace crackled between them. Outside, the rain had stopped for the first time in 2 weeks, and pale winter sunlight pushed through the clouds like something testing whether it was safe to emerge. "Your family's debts," Lucien said, changing the subject with the abruptness of a man who did not enjoy losing ground. "You have been reading estate law." "I've been reading everything. Your household accounts are accessible through the records office. Your shipping routes are documented in the trade ledgers on the third shelf behind your desk in the East Study. And your political correspondence is poorly hidden in the false drawer of the writing table in the long gallery, which any competent thief could locate in under 4 minutes. Lucien set his book down. The silence that followed was a living thing. It had weight and teeth and the slow, circling patience of something deciding whether to attack. "You went through my private documents. I went through everything that was not locked. If you wanted privacy, you should have used locks. Locks are for people who fear thieves. I have never required them because no one in this household would dare." "Then I am the first," she said. Simply, without apology, without provocation. A statement of fact delivered with the calm of someone who had already calculated the consequences and found them acceptable. Lucien stood. He crossed the distance between the chairs in 2 strides and braced his hands on the armrests of the wingback, caging her inside the leather without touching her. His face was close enough that she could see the silver striations in his gray eyes and the thin scar along his left temple that most people never noticed. "Do you understand?" he said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled vibration of something immense held barely in check. "What happens to people who invade my privacy?" She did not flinch, did not lean away, did not breathe faster. "You destroy them. I have read enough of your correspondence to know the method. You identify their vulnerability, apply pressure through financial and social channels until the structure collapses, and then you watch from a distance while they scramble through the wreckage. It is effective. It is thorough. And it requires the target to have something left to lose." She tilted her head. A fraction. Enough to close another inch of distance between them, which should have been retreat but felt like advance. I have nothing, Duke. No estate, no reputation, no family worth protecting, no fortune, no prospects, no social standing. I arrived at your castle with one trunk and one bruise and the clothes your housekeeper selected for me. So tell me, what exactly are you going to destroy?" Lucien stared at her. He had faced down earls, silenced ministers with a glance, made grown men reconsider their alliances over a glass of wine and a single sentence. He was the most feared man in England's aristocracy, and this woman with nothing to her name had just dismantled his primary weapon in under 60 seconds. He straightened slowly, stepped back. His hands dropped to his sides, and he stood there looking at her with an expression that, if Morris had witnessed it, would have caused the old steward to sit down heavily and request brandy. "Who taught you to argue like that?" Lucien asked. "Survival." The word landed between them with the weight of everything she had not yet told him. Every bruise, every night in a house where a gambling brother sold futures like playing cards, every morning waking up in a world that had decided she was currency before she had the chance to decide she was a person. Lucien recognized that word, not the sound of it, the marrow of it, the way it tasted when you said it and meant it, when survival was not a concept discussed over dinner, but the engine that ran every decision you made from the moment your eyes opened until the moment exhaustion dragged you under again. He had built Blackthorne on that word, and she had walked through his doors carrying it like a blade hidden inside her rib cage. "You will not go through my private documents again," he said. Not a command, something closer to negotiation, which startled him more than anything she had said. "Then give me access to the ones that concern me directly. The debts, the terms, the legal structure of my presence here. I will not live inside an arrangement I do not understand." Most people in your position would simply be grateful for shelter. Most people in my position did not choose to be in this position. Gratitude requires agency, Duke. You cannot be thankful for something that was done to you. Lucien turned toward the window. The morning light was strengthening, and below the castle the northern sea churned against the base of the cliffs with relentless repetitive violence. He watched it the way he watched most things, with the detached attention of a man who knew the world was brutal and had decided long ago to be more brutal in return. But something in that equation was shifting, a variable he had not accounted for. "Morris will deliver the relevant documents to your chambers by this afternoon," he said without looking at her. "The financial terms, the legal framework, nothing more. That is a start. It is not a concession, it is efficiency. You will find the information regardless, and I prefer to control the method of delivery rather than discover you rifling through my study at midnight." She almost smiled. He saw it in the reflection against the window glass, a ghost of expression that crossed her face and disappeared, quick as a bird passing through a shaft of light. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me. I have not done anything worthy of thanks. You have treated me like a person for the last 5 minutes. In my experience, that is rarer than you think." Lucien said nothing. She stood, collected her shoes and her book, and left the North Library with the same rigid, measured walk he had observed the night she arrived. Control imposed on a body that had learned to expect impact, armor made of posture. He stayed at the window until the sound of her footsteps vanished into the corridor, and then he stayed longer, watching the sea tear itself apart against the rocks below. Something was wrong with him. He could feel it the way you feel the first tremor before the ground opens. A destabilization, microscopic but real, located somewhere in the architecture of the thing he had spent his entire adult life constructing: the walls, the distance, the precise machinery of indifference that allowed him to dismantle men without losing sleep. Seraphina Ashcombe had found the one crack he did not know existed. She had looked at him without fear, and instead of wanting to correct that, he wanted to understand it. That, more than anything, terrified him. The letter arrived at Blackthorne on a Tuesday, carried by a rider whose horse was half dead from the pace of the journey. Morris brought it to Lucien's study still sealed, the crimson wax stamped with a crest Lucien recognized immediately. Lord Cedric Wren, the Crown's unofficial treasurer, a man who operated in the narrow, lightless space between royal authority and private wealth, and who had accumulated enough leverage over enough powerful men to make himself functionally untouchable. Lucien broke the seal with his thumb and read the letter standing. The language was polite, the threat was not. Cedric Wren demanded Seraphina's return. The Ashcombe debts, Wren argued, predated Lucien's involvement. The original creditors had transferred their claims to Wren 6 months prior, making Seraphina legally his property under the terms of the original agreement. Wren offered Lucien compensation, a sum that would have been generous if Lucien had been a man who measured value in currency. The final paragraph was the knife. If the Duke of Blackthorne refused to comply, Wren would petition the crown directly. The matter would become public. The nature of Lucien's arrangement with the Ashcombe family would be examined in open court, and certain details about Blackthorne's financial operations, details Wren implied he possessed through unnamed sources, would surface during proceedings. Lucien read the letter twice. Then he folded it, placed it in the locked drawer of his desk, and sat in silence for 11 minutes. He was not afraid. Fear was a luxury for men who had something to lose unexpectedly. Lucien had mapped every possible vulnerability in his operation years ago and built contingencies around each one. Wren's threat was real, but it was also clumsy. The man was accustomed to opponents who folded under pressure because they had families and reputations and comfortable lives they did not want disrupted. Lucien had none of those things. What Lucien had was Blackthorne, and Blackthorne was a fortress built not on stone, but on information. Every noble family that had crossed his threshold left fingerprints. Every alliance contained leverage. Every favor granted was a debt recorded, catalogued, and stored in the vast institutional memory of a house that had survived centuries by being more patient and more ruthless than anything the crown could produce. But Wren had said something in the letter that Lucien could not dismiss. He had called Seraphina property. Lucien had used the word transaction 3 days ago. He had described Seraphina's arrival in terms of debt and acquisition and structural management. He had not felt the weight of those words because the language of power had long since replaced the language of humanity in his vocabulary. But hearing another man use the same framework to claim ownership of the same woman produced a response in Lucien that was neither strategic nor rational. It was rage, quiet, dense, the kind that did not burn but compressed, growing heavier and harder inside the chest like a stone forming from heat and pressure in the dark. He rang for Morris. "Send word to my solicitors in London. I want every document related to the Ashcombe debts on my desk within 5 days. Original agreements, transfer records, every signature, every seal. And I want a complete financial profile of Lord Cedric Wren, assets, liabilities, partnerships, properties, political affiliations, everything." Morris nodded. He did not ask why. In 23 years of service, Morris had learned that Lucien's requests carried their own gravity. You did not question gravity. You simply moved before it crushed you. And Morris, "Your Grace, Lady Seraphina does not learn about this letter. Not from you, not from the staff, not from anyone inside these walls." "Understood, Your Grace." Morris departed. Lucien stood at his desk and pressed both palms flat against the wood surface, feeling the grain beneath his fingers like braille for a language he was only beginning to translate. He was protecting her, not as strategy, not as asset management, not as the careful preservation of a valuable piece in a political game. He was protecting her because the thought of Cedric Wren saying the word property in the same sentence as her name made something inside Lucien want to dismantle the man with his bare hands. And that kind of impulse, uncontrolled, unstrategic, purely animal, was exactly the kind of fracture that brought empires down. Below the castle, the sea hammered against the cliffs, and somewhere in the East Wing, Seraphina Ashcombe was reading documents he had given her voluntarily, learning the architecture of her own captivity, and she did not yet know that the walls she was studying were no longer designed to keep her in. They were being rebuilt to keep everything else out. The solicitor's documents arrived from London on a Friday, carried by 2 riders under armed escort, packed in a leather case stamped with seals Lucien had not requested but understood. His attorneys were careful men. Careful men use seals and escorts when the contents of a delivery could ruin lives. Morris placed the case on Lucien's desk at 6:30 in the morning before the rest of the household stirred. Lucien was already awake. He had been awake since 4, standing at the east tower window in the dark, watching the distant pinprick of a ship's lantern cross the black horizon line like a single burning eye searching for land. Sleep had become unreliable over the past week, not from anxiety. Lucien did not experience anxiety in the way ordinary men did. What he experienced was a heightened state of operational awareness that refused to power down, a machine running at full capacity with no task to justify the energy. He knew the task. He simply refused to name it. The case contained 312 pages. Lucien read every one of them between sunrise and noon, standing at his desk because sitting felt too passive for what the documents revealed. The financial architecture of the Ashcombe collapse was worse than he had estimated. Seraphina's brother, Lord Edmund Ashcombe, had not simply gambled away an inheritance. He had systematically leveraged every asset the family possessed: the estate, the London house, the land holdings in Sussex, the shipping interest their grandfather had built over 40 years, and fed them into a network of high-interest loans controlled by men whose names appeared nowhere on any official register. Shadow financing. The kind of operation that existed in the crawl space beneath legitimate banking, where interest rates doubled monthly and collateral was measured not in property, but in people. Edmund had signed his sister's name on 3 separate documents without her knowledge. Her consent was forged on a transfer agreement dated 8 months prior that effectively converted her legal status from independent person to secured asset. In the language of the documents, she was listed as a surety. In the language of the street, she was collateral. And every one of those forged documents had been countersigned by Lord Cedric Wren. Lucien set the final page down and stood motionless for a long time. The rage was still there. It had not dissipated during the week of waiting. If anything, it had calcified, hardened into something with structure and edges, like bone forming around a wound the body knows will never fully heal but refuses to leave unprotected. He understood now what Wren wanted, not Seraphina herself. Wren wanted what Seraphina represented: leverage. A legal chain that connected the Ashcombe debts to Blackthorne's finances, giving Wren a doorway into Lucien's operations that no direct attack could provide. Take the woman back, pull the thread, unravel the Duke. It was elegant in its brutality. Lucien would have admired the strategy if the instrument of it had not been a human being. He locked the documents in his desk and went to find Seraphina. She was in the North Library again, his chair again, reading again. But this time she looked up when he entered, and the quality of her attention had changed. Something in the week between their first conversation and this moment had shifted the calibration of her awareness. She watched him now, not with the defensive calculation of their first meeting, but with something more complex. Wariness layered over curiosity, layered over something she was working very hard to keep invisible. "I need to tell you something," Lucien said. She closed her book. That sentence has never preceded good news in the history of the English language. Your brother forged your signature on 3 financial documents. He sold your legal personhood to Cedric Wren's creditors 8 months before you arrived here. You are listed as collateral on debts you did not authorize and did not know about. He delivered this without softening, not because he was cruel, but because he had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do to someone in crisis was wrap the truth in padding. Padded truths took longer to understand, and understanding was the only weapon she would have. Seraphina did not move, did not blink. Her fingers remained on the closed cover of her book, and for the space of 3 heartbeats, she was so still that the room itself seemed to hold its breath around her. Then she exhaled. It was a small sound, controlled. The kind of exhalation a person makes when something they always suspected is finally confirmed, and the confirmation is simultaneously a relief and a devastation, because at least now the shape of the enemy is clear. "Which documents?" she said. Not why. Not how could he. Not the performative shock of a woman who expected better from her blood. She went straight to which documents, because Seraphina Ashcombe had lived inside the wreckage of her family long enough to know that betrayal was not an event, but a pattern, and patterns could be mapped. Lucien pulled the relevant pages from inside his coat, 3 sheets he had extracted from the case for this purpose, and handed them to her. She read them standing, her eyes moving across the legal language with the fluency of someone who had spent 2 weeks teaching herself estate law from the books in his library. "The 3rd one," she said after a full minute. "The 3rd one is dated the day after my 21st birthday." "Yes." He waited until I was of legal age, so the forgery would hold. Yes. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry, completely, terrifyingly dry. And in that dryness, Lucian saw something he recognized from his own mirror on the worst mornings of his life. The absence of tears was not strength. It was depletion. The well had been drained so many times that there was nothing left to draw from, and the body simply stopped trying. My brother, she said quietly, celebrated my 21st birthday with a dinner at the London house. He gave me our mother's cameo brooch. He said it was what she would have wanted. She set the documents on the arm of the chair. And then he went upstairs and sold me. Lucian said nothing. There was nothing to say. Comfort would have been an insult. Sympathy would have been a performance. The only thing he could offer that had any value was the truth of what he intended to do about it, and even that felt insufficient against the weight of what her own blood had done. Ren wants you returned to his custody, Lucian said. He sent a letter. He will petition the crown if I refuse. And will you refuse? The question was quiet, not pleading, not demanding. Just a woman standing in a borrowed dress in a borrowed library, asking a man she had known for 10 days whether he intended to hand her over to a man who had purchased her like livestock. I will do more than refuse, Lucian said. Something shifted in the air between them. A vibration. Subsonic. The frequency of a decision being made that both of them understood could not be unmade. Why? She asked. Lucien considered the question. He could give her strategy. He could explain that Ren's claim represented a vulnerability in Blackthorne's legal perimeter that needed to be eliminated. He could frame his response as institutional self-defense, which it partly was, and she would accept that because she was smart enough to understand that powerful men did not act from sentiment. But the truth sat in his chest like a stone he was tired of carrying, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he did not want to lie to this woman who had been lied to by everyone she had ever trusted. Because you are not property, he said, and any man who treats you as such will answer to me. The words came out harder than he intended, rougher, stripped of the diplomatic polish he applied to every interaction like lacquer over raw wood. They sounded almost angry, which confused him because the anger was not directed at her. Serafina studied him for a long moment, then she nodded once. What do you need from me? She asked. Your testimony, written and signed, confirming the forgeries, confirming you did not authorize any of the agreements bearing your name. You will have it by morning. And I need you to stay inside Blackthorne until this is resolved, not as imprisonment, as protection. Ren has resources, and he will move quickly once he understands I am not negotiating. I have been inside Blackthorne for 10 days, Duke. I have not once attempted to leave. I noticed. Did your steward report that as well? Morris reports everything. It is why I have not fired him despite his tendency to editorialize. The ghost smile appeared again. Quicker this time, less guarded. Gone before it fully formed, but its afterimage remained in the slight softening around her eyes, a warmth she permitted for exactly 1 second before the armor reassembled. Then I will stay, she said, and you will fight. I always fight. No, she said, and something in her voice dropped to a register he had not heard before. You always win. Fighting is what happens when winning is not guaranteed. I want to know if you can do both. Lucien held her gaze for 3 full seconds. In that interval, something passed between them that neither would acknowledge aloud for weeks. Not attraction, not alliance. Something more fundamental, recognition. The bone-deep identification of one survivor by another across a room full of silence and firelight, each seeing in the other the same scar tissue, the same architecture of endurance, the same refusal to be consumed by a world that had tried its best. Watch me, he said, and he left the library with the distinct and unsettling sensation that the ground beneath his feet had shifted permanently, and he was no longer walking on solid stone, but on something alive and unpredictable, and infinitely more dangerous. London in winter was a different kind of predator than Northumbria. The northern countryside killed with cold and isolation. London killed with proximity. Too many people, too many agendas, too many drawing rooms where alliances were formed and destroyed over champagne and canapés, while string quartets played music designed to mask the sound of knives being sharpened beneath the table. Lucian arrived in the city 3 days after his conversation with Serafina, traveling with Morris and 4 of his private guards in a black carriage that bore no crest. He had learned early in his career that visibility was a choice, and the moments that required the most power often demanded the least display. A man who announced himself was a man who needed others to know he had arrived. Lucien needed no such confirmation. His presence in a room changed the barometric pressure, whether anyone saw him enter or not. His London residence occupied a narrow Georgian townhouse on a street so quiet that the neighbors had never once complained, primarily because the neighbors were terrified of him. The house functioned not as a home, but as an operational base. No art on the walls, no personal effects, a desk, a fireplace, a bed he rarely used, and a room on the second floor containing locked cabinets filled with information that could reshape the political landscape of England if deployed carelessly. Lucien never deployed anything carelessly. He sent word to 3 men within the first hour. Sir Philip Greaves, a barrister whose loyalty to Lucien was cemented by the fact that Lucien had once prevented the exposure of Greaves's son's involvement in a financial scandal that would have ended the family name. Thomas Hale, a former intelligence officer turned private investigator who operated in the space between law and shadow with the moral flexibility of a man who had seen too much to believe in clean hands. And Lord Alistair Pennington, an elderly peer who controlled a significant voting bloc in Parliament and who owed Lucien a favor that neither of them had ever discussed in explicit terms. Greaves arrived first, a thin man with spectacles and the nervous energy of someone who lived permanently on the edge of precision. He reviewed the Ashcombe documents in Lucian's study while Lucian stood at the window and watched the street below with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to watching. "The forgeries are obvious to anyone looking for them," Greaves said. "The signature variants alone would hold up in court. But the problem is not the forgeries, Your Grace. The problem is the chain of custody. Wren has routed these debts through 4 separate entities, each of which is technically legitimate. To invalidate his claim on Lady Serafina, we would need to challenge every transfer in sequence. That is months of litigation, possibly years." "I do not have years." "Then you need a different strategy." "I have one. I need you to build the legal architecture around it." Greaves removed his spectacles and polished them with the slow deliberation of a man who suspected he was about to hear something that would keep him awake for several nights. "What strategy, Your Grace?" "I am going to announce Serafina Ashcombe as my intended Duchess." The room went silent. Even the fire seemed to hesitate. "Your Grace," Greaves replaced his spectacles carefully, "you understand the implications." "I understand them completely. If you announce an engagement, Wren's claim becomes a direct challenge to a ducal marriage contract. That elevates the dispute from civil court to the Crown's jurisdiction. It forces the matter into public view. It makes enemies of every noble family allied with Wren, which is all of them, I know. And it places Lady Serafina at the center of a political firestorm that could destroy both of you. She has survived worse than politics." Greaves stared at Lucien for a long moment. In 20 years of legal service to the Vale family, he had never seen the Duke make a decision based on anything other than calculated advantage. Every move Lucian made was engineered. Every risk was measured against return. Every action served the architecture of Blackthorne's power. This was different. This was a man building a fortress around a single person and daring the entire kingdom to breach it. The strategy was sound, legally defensible, politically bold, but beneath its rational surface, Greaves could see something he had never associated with Lucien Vale. Desperation was too strong a word. Investment was too weak. The closest term Greaves could find was commitment, and the discovery of that quality in the most ruthless man in England frightened the barrister more than any legal battle ever had. "I will draft the announcement," Greaves said, "and I will prepare the defense." "There will be no defense," Lucien said. "There will only be offense. If Wren moves against us, I want to be the one who strikes first. Prepare everything." Greaves nodded and departed with the careful posture of a man leaving a room that contained something volatile. Thomas Hale arrived an hour later. Where Greaves was precise and nervous, Hale was broad-shouldered and calm, with the stillness of a man who had spent years in places where sudden movement got people killed. He listened to Lucian's instructions without interruption. his eyes tracking the information with the flat efficiency of a machine processing data. "I need everything on Ren that does not exist on paper," Lucian said. "The payments that go nowhere, the properties that appear in no register, the people he meets who have no names. I want the architecture of his shadow operation mapped within 2 weeks. 2 weeks is tight. Make it work. This is going to make noise, Your Grace. The moment I start pulling at Ren's threads, he's going to feel it." "Good. Let him feel it. I want him to know I am coming. Fear makes men stupid, and I need Cedric Wren to be very stupid very quickly." Hale allowed himself a thin smile. "And if he is not stupid? If he moves first? Then you will know because Blackthorne will send word, and you will respond accordingly." "Accordingly" covers a wide range of actions, Your Grace. "Use your judgment. You always have." Hale stood, buttoned his coat, and paused at the door. "The woman, Lady Seraphina. Is she worth what this is going to cost?" It was not a question Hale would normally ask, but Hale was not a normal man, and he had worked for Lucian long enough to understand that the answer mattered, not for strategic reasons, but because it would determine how far he would need to go and how dark the terrain would get. Lucian's answer came without hesitation. Yes. It was a single syllable. It carried no elaboration, no qualification, no strategic framework to justify itself. Just a word, spoken by a man who had spent 28 years building a life on the principle that nothing and no one was worth risking his empire for. Hale nodded and left. Lucien stood alone in his London study and pressed his knuckles against the desk until the wood grain imprinted itself on his skin. He could feel the machinery of his life reconfiguring around a new axis, gears shifting, priorities realigning. The entire internal architecture of a man who had always placed Blackthorne at the center of every calculation now quietly, irrevocably reorienting around something else. He was not equipped for this. Control was his native language. Strategy was his operating system. Every relationship he had ever maintained was transactional because transactions were predictable and predictability was safety. The moment you allowed another person to occupy space inside your decision-making process, you introduced a variable you could not control, and uncontrolled variables were how empires collapsed. He knew this. He had always known this. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he did not see the documents or the legal strategy or the map of Ren's vulnerabilities. He saw Seraphina standing in the entrance hall of Blackthorne, dripping on the marble, refusing the fire, refusing the chair, refusing to be anything other than exactly what she was. A woman who had been stripped of everything and still stood in the center of the room like she owned the space she occupied because ownership was not about titles or deeds or legal documents. Ownership was about refusing to be removed. He opened his eyes and stared at the wall of his study where no art hung and no personal history existed. He was falling. He could feel it the way you feel altitude drop in an aircraft, the stomach-hollow sensation of descent when the ground is still too far below to see. Not towards something, into something. Something without a floor, without a net, without any of the structural safeguards he had spent his entire life building precisely to prevent this kind of freefall. Lucian Vale, the Duke of Blackthorne, the most feared man in England, the architect of ruined families and shattered alliances, was falling for a woman he had known for 13 days. And the worst part, the truly terrifying part, was not the falling itself. It was that he did not want to stop. He returned to Blackthorne 5 days later. The ride north took 2 days and cost 1 horse, pushed too hard through freezing rain by a rider who did not care because the urgency driving him had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with a hunger he could not name. When the black towers of the castle appeared against the gray sky, Lucian felt something release in his chest that he had not realized was clenched, the tension of absence, the physical discomfort of distance from the thing your body has decided it requires, regardless of what your mind thinks about the matter. He found Seraphina in the records office on the ground floor, surrounded by ledgers she had organized into stacks with handwritten labels. She had taken the documents he offered and expanded them into a comprehensive audit of Blackthorne's household operations, cross-referencing expenditures against revenue with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that knowledge was the only capital no one could steal. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression shifted. Not a smile, not relief, a settling. the way a compass needle stops spinning when it finds north. You were gone longer than Morris estimated, she said. Morris estimated 3 days. I took 5. He was worried. Morris is always worried. It is his primary occupation. He was worried about you specifically. He kept checking the road from the East Tower. And you know this because? Because I was also checking the road from the East Tower. We took turns. The admission hung in the air between them. She had delivered it without embarrassment, without coyness, without the social armor that most women of her class would have deployed to disguise the vulnerability of having watched for a man's return. She simply said it. She had watched for him, and she was not ashamed of that fact. Lucian set his traveling coat on the back of a chair and sat across from her at the records table. He smelled like rain and horse and the cold iron scent of a man who had ridden through weather that should have slowed him down and did not. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer without strategy, without calculation, without the version of yourself that armors every response before it leaves your mouth." Serafina set down her pen. That is a significant request from a man who has never done the same. "I know. I am asking anyway." She waited. Her hands rested flat on the table, palms down, and he noticed for the first time that her fingernails were short and uneven, bitten or broken. The hands of a woman who had spent months in conditions that did not include manicures and ladies' maids. Real hands. Working hands. Hands that belonged to the life she had actually lived, not the one her title suggested she should have. "I'm going to announce our engagement," Lucienne said. "Publicly. To the crown and to society. It is the fastest legal mechanism to void Wren's claim on you. A betrothal to a duke overrides prior civil debts because it elevates your legal status to a position Wren cannot challenge without directly confronting the peerage. It is strategic, it is defensible, and it is the only path that does not involve years of litigation we do not have." He paused. "But I will not do it without your consent, actual consent. Not the coerced agreement of a woman who has no alternatives, but the genuine decision of a person who understands exactly what this means and chooses it anyway." Serafina studied him. Her dark eyes moved across his face the way they had moved across legal documents all week, reading for subtext, searching for the clause hidden beneath the surface language. "What does it mean?" she asked. "Beyond the legal mechanism. It means the entire aristocracy will believe I intend to marry you. It means every enemy I have will target you because you become the most visible symbol of my vulnerability. It means newspapers will print your name alongside mine, and the court will dissect your history, and your family's disgrace will become public entertainment. And it means—" He stopped. The next words required him to cross a threshold he had never crossed before, not in strategy, not in negotiation, not in any conversation with any human being in his 28 years of life. It required honesty. "It means I will be lying to the crown," he said quietly. "But I will not be lying to myself." The room became very still. The fire crackled in the records office hearth. Wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere below them, the sea continued its eternal assault against the cliffs, indifferent to the small, enormous thing happening in a stone room above it. "You are telling me this is not only strategy," Serafina said. "I am telling you I wanted it to be only strategy. It would be simpler, cleaner, safer. I have spent my entire life ensuring that every decision I make serves Blackthorne's interests and nothing else. That discipline is the reason I am still standing while men older, wealthier, and better connected than me have fallen." His hands were on the table now, mirroring hers, and the distance between their fingers was small enough that the warmth of her skin was perceptible across the gap. "But I have spent 5 days in London thinking about your safety and your legal position and Cedric Wren's financial architecture, and at least 40% of my processing capacity has been occupied not by any of those things, but by the memory of you standing in my entrance hall telling me you required nothing. And that percentage is increasing, daily, which is a problem I do not know how to solve because you cannot strategize against your own nervous system." Serafina's breath changed, a subtle shift, deeper, slower. The kind of breathing adjustment that occurs when the body recognizes something important is happening and begins conserving resources for the response. "That is the least romantic declaration I have ever heard," she said. "I am not a romantic man." No, you are a man who quantifies emotional responses in percentages and calls human connection a processing problem. Is that a rejection? It is an observation. She paused. And it is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me. She turned her right hand over on the table. Palm up. Open. Not reaching for him. Just available. An offering without demand. A door unlocked but not pushed open. Lucien looked at her hand the way a man looks at a cliff edge before deciding whether to jump. The calculation was instantaneous and ruthless, as all his calculations were. If he took her hand, he crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The engagement would become real beneath its strategic surface. The vulnerability would become permanent. The fortress he had spent his life constructing around his own interior would acquire a door that someone else held the key to, and doors were weaknesses, and weaknesses were how you died. Every survival instinct he possessed told him to stand up, maintain distance, execute the engagement as pure strategy, and keep the emotional component locked in a compartment where it could not interfere with operations. He took her hand. Her fingers closed around his with a pressure that was neither gentle nor aggressive. Firm. Present. The grip of a person who understood that holding on was a decision that required as much courage as letting go, and who had made the decision deliberately. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped across a table covered in ledgers and legal documents, in a stone room in a castle perched on the edge of England, while outside the wind howled and the sea raged, and the kingdom they were about to challenge continued spinning in its orbit of corruption and power, oblivious to the fact that two damaged people had just done something far more dangerous than any political maneuver. They had chosen each other. And in a world built on leverage and transaction, and the careful management of human beings as assets, that choice was the most radical act of rebellion either of them had ever committed. The announcement detonated across London society like cannon fire. The Duke of Blackthorne, the most reclusive and feared nobleman in England, had declared his intention to marry the disgraced daughter of a ruined marquess, a woman whose family name had become synonymous with financial catastrophe, a woman with no dowry, no connections, no political value whatsoever. The reaction was immediate, universal, and vicious. Drawing rooms that had spent years whispering about Lucien's ruthlessness now whispered about his sanity. Newspapers that had never dared criticize him directly found their courage through the proxy of Serafina's reputation. She was called an opportunist, a fortune hunter, a fallen woman who had seduced a powerful man through desperation disguised as charm. The language was creative in its cruelty, the way English society had always been creative when destroying women it could not control. At Blackthorne, Lucien read every newspaper, every editorial, every society column that mentioned Serafina's name alongside adjectives designed to strip her of dignity. He read them at his desk in the East Study with the methodical attention of a man building a target list. Every name went into a file. Every publication, every writer, every anonymous source quoted with the cowardly precision of people who wanted to wound without being identified. The file would be useful later, but the immediate threat was not gossip. The immediate threat was Cedric Wren, and Wren responded to the engagement announcement exactly as Lucien anticipated. Within 48 hours of the news reaching London, Wren filed a formal petition with the Crown challenging the betrothal on the grounds that Serafina Ashcombe was legally encumbered by prior financial obligations that predated the Duke's claim. In plain language, Wren told the Crown that Lucien was trying to marry a woman who belonged to someone else. Greaves delivered the petition documents to Blackthorne by courier. Lucien read them in the North Library while Serafina sat in his chair, which had now become her chair through the simple mechanism of persistent occupation, and watched him pace. "He is faster than I expected," Lucien said. "You expected him to be slow?" "I expected him to be cautious. Wren has survived this long because he moves in shadows. Filing a public petition drags him into daylight. That is either desperation or confidence, and I need to determine which before I respond." "It is both," Serafina said. Lucien stopped pacing and looked at her. "He is desperate because your announcement threatens his leverage," she continued. "If I am legally bound to you through marriage, his claim evaporates. The debts become unenforceable against a duchess. He knows that. But he is also confident because he has spent years accumulating allies inside the Crown's administration. He does not need to win in court. He needs to delay the marriage long enough to apply pressure through other channels. Lucien stared at her. What other channels? Serafina's expression did not change, but something behind it compressed. The look of a person about to disclose information they have been carrying alone for too long. My brother did not gamble randomly, she said. The debts were not accidents. Edmund was recruited. Someone identified his weaknesses, his vanity, his need for social status, and systematically encouraged his worst impulses until he was deep enough in debt to be useful. Useful for what? Access. Our family had connections to the royal treasury through our father's former position. Edmund still had social access to treasury officials. The gambling debts were the mechanism. Once he was compromised, he could be directed. Introduce this person to that person. Mention this opportunity at that dinner. Carry this message to that office. And the person directing him was Wren. But Wren, or someone operating through Wren. I have not been able to determine which, but the debts were not the point. The debts were the collar. My brother was the dog, and someone was holding the leash long before the money ran out. Lucien sat down slowly, not in a chair, on the edge of the desk, a break in protocol that Morris would have noted with alarm if he had been present. Lucien did not sit on furniture like that. He did not arrange himself casually. Every physical position he occupied was deliberate, controlled, designed to project authority. Sitting on the edge of a desk was the posture of a man whose body had stopped performing because his mind was processing something that required all available resources. You have known this, he said. I have suspected it for months. I had no proof until I read your political correspondence in the false drawer of the writing table. The correspondence you accessed without permission. The correspondence that confirmed what I already knew. Your letters mentioned discrepancies in treasury allocations that your contacts inside Parliament could not explain. Missing funds, redirected revenues, money that entered the Crown's accounts and vanished before it reached its designated purpose. And you believe Wren is connected to those discrepancies. I believe Wren hunts the discrepancies. I believe he has been siphoning Crown funds through a network of shell operations for years, and I believe my brother was one of the instruments he used to facilitate the transfers. And I believe, she paused, I believe the reason Wren wants me returned is not the debts. The debts are trivial compared to what he stands to lose. He wants me because I know things Edmund told me. Fragments. Names, dates. Things Edmund mentioned when he was drunk and careless and did not realize his sister was listening because men like my brother never believe women are listening. What things? Enough to build a case, not enough to prove one. Not yet. Lucien looked at her for a long time. The fire had burned low and the library was dim, the kind of dim that softened edges and made faces look like paintings, all shadow and highlight and the suggestion of expression rather than expression itself. You came to Blackthorne with a plan, he said. It was not a question. Serafina met his gaze steadily. I came to Blackthorne with no alternatives, but I came with information, and information is the only currency I have ever possessed. When I read your documents, I was not invading your privacy for sport. I was determining whether you were the kind of man who would use what I knew or bury it. And what did you determine? That you have spent years trying to expose the same corruption I have been collecting evidence of from the inside. That your reputation for ruthlessness is not cruelty, but strategy. That you destroy individuals because the system itself is too large and too protected to dismantle head-on. So you remove its supports one by one until the structure collapses under its own weight. That is a generous reading of my methods. It is an accurate one. Generous would be calling you noble. You are not noble, Duke. You are effective. And right now, effective is what I need. Lucien almost smiled. Almost. The muscles engaged. The expression began its formation, but he arrested it at the last moment because smiling felt like surrender, and he was not ready to surrender anything else tonight. He had already surrendered enough. We combine our information, he said. Everything you have. Everything I have. Hale is already mapping Wren's shadow operations. If your fragments fill the gaps in his investigation, we may be able to build a case that does not require the courts at all. What does it require? Parliament. A case presented directly to the right members, with evidence strong enough that they cannot ignore it without making themselves complicit. Wren survives because his corruption is useful to the people who benefit from it. The moment it becomes more dangerous to protect him than to sacrifice him, they will turn. And if they do not turn, then I will make the cost of protecting him so catastrophic that turning becomes the only rational option. Serafina studied him. You are describing political warfare. I am describing survival, my survival, your survival, and incidentally, the survival of a system that is rotting from the inside because men like Wren have been feeding on it for decades, while everyone with the power to stop them chose comfort over confrontation. And you chose confrontation. I chose Blackthorne. Blackthorne requires a functioning system to operate within. When the system fails, everything I have built fails with it. So yes, I fight the corruption. Not from idealism, from architecture. A building is only as strong as the ground it stands on. Serafina stood. She crossed the distance between the chair and the desk where Lucien sat and stood close enough that he could see the faint pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. A small, rhythmic motion, proof of blood and breath and the fundamental, irreducible aliveness of a person who had been treated as a number on a ledger. Then we build this together, she said. We build this together, he confirmed. The word together sat between them like a new element on a periodic table. Something that had not existed in either of their vocabularies before this moment. Something unstable, reactive, potentially dangerous, and utterly necessary. Somewhere beyond the library windows, the Northumbrian wind screamed across the cliffs, and the sea threw itself against the rocks with the mindless persistence of a force that did not know how to stop. And inside Blackthorne Castle, two people who had spent their entire lives surviving alone made the most terrifying decision of their existence. They decided to stop. The writer arrived at 3 a.m. Lucien was awake. He was in the East Study reviewing the consolidated intelligence from Hale's preliminary report when Morris appeared in the doorway with a face the color of old parchment. Your Grace, a message, urgent. The message was from Hale. 2 lines, written in the cramped, hurried script of a man who did not have time for punctuation. Wren has petitioned the Crown for an emergency seizure order. Armed escort dispatched to Blackthorne. They ride at dawn. Lucien read the message once. Then he burned it in the candle flame on his desk and watched the paper curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash in his fingers. Armed escort, dispatched to Blackthorne, to seize Serafina under Crown authority. Wren had moved faster than Lucien calculated. Not by days, by weeks. Which meant one of 2 things. Either Wren had pre-positioned the petition before Lucien's engagement announcement, anticipating the move, or someone inside Lucien's operation had leaked information about the timing. Neither possibility was acceptable. Both were survivable. But survival now required something Lucien had not deployed in years. Not strategy, not information, not the quiet, surgical application of financial and political pressure that had made him the most feared man in England. It required war. He rang for Morris. Wake every member of the household guard. Seal the gates. No one enters or leaves Blackthorne without my direct authorization. Your Grace, then wake Lady Serafina. Tell her to dress. Tell her to bring every document she possesses. And tell her... He stopped. His hand rested on the desk where her hand had rested hours ago, and for one fraction of a second, the machinery of his mind ceased its calculations and produced instead a single image. Her face in the firelight, the steadiness of her eyes, the grip of her fingers around his, firm, present, deliberate. Tell her they are coming, Lucien said, and tell her I am not going to let them take her. Morris departed at a speed that contradicted his age, and Lucien Vale stood alone in the dark heart of Blackthorne Castle, while outside, somewhere to the south, armed men were already riding through the night toward his gates. The Duke who ruled through control had just lost it, and for the first time in his life, he did not want it back. He wanted something else entirely, and he would burn everything he had built to keep it. Lucien had 17 men under arms when the Crown's escort appeared on the southern road at 8:30 a.m. He watched them from the battlements of Blackthorne's East Tower, standing in the same position where he had watched storms and ships and the slow rotation of seasons across the Northumbrian coastline for years. But this morning the coastline was irrelevant. The entire aperture of his attention had narrowed to a column of riders moving through the gray winter landscape like a dark stain spreading across wet cloth. 24 men, maybe 26, mounted, armed, carrying a crown warrant that gave them legal authority to enter his estate, remove Serafina Ashcombe from his custody, and deliver her to Lord Cedric Wren's jurisdiction. Legal authority. The phrase tasted like metal in Lucian's mouth. He had spent his career operating within the legal framework of English power, bending its mechanisms to serve his purposes with the precision of a man who understood that the law was not justice but architecture, and architecture could be redesigned by anyone with the right tools. But this was different. This was the framework itself being weaponized against him by a man who had corrupted the system so thoroughly that the system could no longer distinguish between its own function and Wren's manipulation of it. Morris stood 3 feet behind Lucian on the battlement, breathing hard from the climb. The old steward had not slept. Neither had anyone in the household. The hours between Hale's message and dawn had transformed Blackthorne from a residence into a military position with the grim efficiency of a building that had been designed for exactly this purpose 400 years ago. Gates sealed. Entrances reinforced. The household guard distributed across defensive positions that Morris had located in architectural plans stored in the records office. Plans Serafina had organized 2 weeks earlier without knowing they would become operational. 24 riders, Morris said, perhaps more behind the tree line. 26, Lucian corrected, 2 outriders flanking the column at 50-yard intervals, scout formation. They expect resistance. Do they get it? Lucian did not answer immediately. The column was close enough now to see individual details. The lead rider carried a standard, not military colors, but the administrative seal of the Crown's civil authority. This was technically not a military operation. It was a legal one, an enforcement action carried out under warrant, staffed by men who occupied the gray territory between soldiers and bureaucrats armed enough to compel compliance, but dressed in enough legal fiction to maintain the pretense that this was civil procedure rather than state violence. The distinction mattered. If Lucian resisted a civil enforcement action, he was obstructing the Crown's legal authority. That was a crime. If he resisted a military operation, he was defending his estate. That was a right. Wren had chosen the civil route deliberately, forcing Lucian into a position where any physical resistance would criminalize him regardless of the merits of his case. It was, Lucian admitted silently, a good move. "Open the gates," Lucian said. Morris turned sharply. "Your Grace?" "Open the gates. Let them in. Station the guard in the courtyard, but weapons lowered. I want every man visible, but not threatening." "You are letting them enter." "I am letting them enter a stage I control." "There is a difference." Morris hesitated for exactly 1 second, which was 1 second longer than he had ever hesitated in 23 years of service, and then descended the tower stairs to execute the order. Lucien remained on the battlement for another minute. Below him, Blackthorne's gates groaned open on iron hinges that had not moved in months, and the sound echoed across the courtyard like the voice of the castle itself protesting the intrusion. He watched the column slow as the gates opened, watched the lead rider's posture shift from aggressive certainty to cautious surprise. They had expected locked doors. They had prepared for obstruction. Finding the gates open introduced a variable they had not rehearsed, and unprepared men made mistakes. Lucien descended the tower and crossed the courtyard to the main entrance at a pace calibrated to arrive exactly when the lead rider dismounted. Not before, not after. Timing was language, and the message Lucien intended to communicate was simple. I am not waiting for you. I am not hiding from you. I arrived at this moment because I chose to, and every second of this encounter will proceed according to my rhythm, not yours. The lead officer was a man named Hartwell. Lucien recognized him from 3 prior encounters at administrative functions in London. Mid-40s, competent enough to be given authority, but not talented enough to question it. The kind of man who executed warrants because the system told him to and went home afterward and slept soundly because following orders was the same as being right. Hartwell dismounted and presented the warrant with the practiced formality of a man who had done this many times. and had learned to treat the ceremony as a shield against whatever he might feel about the act itself. Your Grace, by order of the Crown, I am authorized to take custody of Lady Seraphina Ashcombe and transport her to London, where she will be remanded to the jurisdiction of Lord Cedric Wren, pending resolution of outstanding financial obligations. Lucian took the warrant, read it completely, every line, every clause, every signature. Hartwell shifted his weight during the silence, uncomfortable in the way all men were uncomfortable when Lucian gave his full attention to a document in their presence, because the attention itself felt like a weapon being loaded. This warrant was issued by Chancellor Whitmore, Lucian said. It was, Your Grace. Chancellor Whitmore owes Lord Cedric Wren £40,000 in personal gambling debts, a fact documented in records I am prepared to present to Parliament at the earliest opportunity. Hartwell's jaw tightened. The validity of the warrant is not for me to assess, Your Grace. No, it is for you to execute, and you will execute it over my explicit objection, which I am now stating for the record, and which my solicitor will reference in the formal challenge I intend to file before you reach London. That is your right, Your Grace. My rights extend considerably further than that, Hartwell, but for the moment, I am choosing restraint. Remember that word when this is over. Restraint. It will matter. Lucien handed the warrant back. His fingers were steady, his voice was level. The 17 armed men stationed around the courtyard stood motionless, weapons lowered, faces blank with the disciplined emptiness of men who had been trained to wait for orders they hoped would never come. Lady Seraphina will be presented to you within the hour, Lucien said. She will be accompanied by my solicitor's representative, who will document every aspect of the transfer. She will not be touched. She will not be restrained. She will not be addressed except through legal counsel. If any of these conditions are violated, I will consider the warrant void and respond accordingly. Hartwell nodded once. He was sweating despite the cold. Lucien turned and walked back into Blackthorne without looking at the 26 armed men filling his courtyard. Behind him, the sound of horses stamping on frozen ground echoed against the castle walls like a countdown. He found Seraphina in the east study. She was standing, not sitting. Dressed in the gray wool she favored, her hair pulled back, her face composed with the terrible stillness of a person who has already processed the worst-case scenario and is now simply waiting for reality to confirm it. You heard, Lucian said. I heard everything from the window. Then you know what is happening. You are letting them take me. The words dropped between them like stones into deep water. Lucien felt each one strike the surface of something inside him that he had not known was liquid until that moment. Something that could ripple. Something that could drown. I am letting them execute a warrant I cannot legally obstruct without making both of us fugitives. If I resist by force, Wren gets what he actually wants, which is not you. It is my criminalization. The moment I raise arms against a Crown warrant, every legal protection I have built around Blackthorne evaporates. Every ally in Parliament distances themselves. Every case I am building against Wren becomes inadmissible because it was assembled by a man who defied the Crown's authority. So you sacrifice me to preserve your position. I sacrifice nothing. His voice hardened. A degree of temperature that shifted the air between them, the way pressure shifts before lightning. You will be transferred to London under legal custody. My solicitor will file an emergency challenge within hours. Greaves has already prepared the documentation. The challenge will be heard within 72 hours because I have enough leverage over the Lord Chancellor's scheduling office to guarantee expedited review. And in those 72 hours, I will be in Wren's jurisdiction. You will be in Crown custody, not Wren's personal custody. There is a legal distinction. There is a legal distinction, and then there is what actually happens to women inside systems controlled by men like Wren. The sentence landed with surgical precision, not hysterical, not pleading. A statement of empirical fact delivered by a woman who had lived inside exactly the kind of system she was describing and understood its mechanics in a way Lucien, for all his intelligence, could only approximate. He stood very still. The machinery of his mind was running at full capacity, processing variables, calculating timelines, measuring risk against cost against probability. But underneath the machinery, in the place where the gears connected to something older and less rational than strategy, a different calculation was occurring. one that had nothing to do with legal frameworks or political leverage or the preservation of institutional power. She was right. The legal distinction between Crown custody and Wren's personal control was exactly as thin as she said it was. Wren had spent years embedding himself inside the Crown's administrative apparatus. His people staffed key positions. His money had purchased loyalty in exactly the offices that would process Serafina's custody transfer. The 72 hours between her removal from Blackthorne and Greaves's emergency hearing were not a gap in the legal timeline. They were a window, and windows could be used. "I will send Hale with you," Lucien Ishiyen said, "and 4 of my own men disguised as household staff. You will not be alone." "That is not what I'm asking." "What are you asking?" She crossed the distance between them. Close. Closer than she had ever stood voluntarily. Close enough that he could see the faint tremor in her hands that she was controlling through sheer force of will, and the sight of that tremor, that small, involuntary proof of fear, in a woman who had shown none since the night she walked into his entrance hall, cracked something inside Lucien's chest that made a sound only he could hear. "I'm asking you to look at me and tell me that your plan will work. Not your legal strategy, not your political calculation. Look at me, Lucien, and tell me you will get me back." She used his name. Not Duke, not Your Grace. Lucien. It was the first time anyone had spoken his given name inside Blackthorne in over a decade. The sound of it in her voice did something to the wiring of his nervous system that he could not catalog or control. A short circuit, a bypass. The rational architecture of his mind momentarily overridden by something that operated on a frequency strategy could not reach. "I will get you back," he said. "If the law works, I will use the law. If the law fails, I will use everything else. And if everything else fails, I will come to London myself, and I will take you out of whatever building they put you in, and I will bring you back to Blackthorne, and they can call it whatever they want." That would be treason. Yes. You would risk Blackthorne. Yes. Everything you built. Everything I built means nothing if I let them take you and do nothing. The words came out raw, unfinished, without the polish he applied to every statement like armor. They were the verbal equivalent of a man standing without his coat in a rainstorm, exposed to whatever the sky decided to throw at him, and the fact that Lucien Vale had never in his life permitted anyone to see him in that condition made the moment land with a gravity that bent the air around them. Serafina reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest. Not a romantic gesture, a diagnostic one. Feeling for the heartbeat beneath the fabric, confirming something she needed confirmed before she could walk out of this room and into the hands of men who would treat her as a line item on a ledger. His heart was hammering. She felt it. He knew she felt it. And for 1 second, the architecture of control that defined every molecule of Lucien Vale's existence dissolved completely. And he was nothing but a man with a racing heart and a woman's hand on his chest, and the knowledge that in less than an hour she would be gone. 72 hours, she said. Less. I will make it less. She removed her hand, straightened, rebuilt the posture of a woman who knew how to walk into hostile territory because she had been doing it her entire life. "Then I will see you in London, Duke." The title returned. The armor reassembled. She became Lady Serafina Ashcombe again, composed and rigid and impenetrable, and she walked out of the east study and down the corridor toward the courtyard, where 26 armed men waited to escort her away from the only place that had ever treated her like a person. Lucien did not follow. He stood at the window and watched the column depart through the gates of Blackthorne, with Serafina's figure visible near the center, mounted on a horse his stable master had selected for temperament and speed, flanked by Hale and 4 of Lucien's men wearing borrowed livery. The column moved south along the road, growing smaller against the gray landscape, until it became a dark line, and then a smudge, and then nothing. The gates closed behind them, and Lucien Vale stood alone in his castle for the first time in weeks, and discovered that solitude, which had once been his most reliable companion, now felt like something with teeth. He went to work, not with grief, not with paralysis, with the cold, mechanical focus of a man who had converted every emotion in his body into fuel and aimed it at a single objective. The next 48 hours would determine whether his legal strategy held or whether he would need to execute the contingency he had described to Serafina, the one that involved treason and the destruction of everything he had spent his life building. He did not care which one it was. That realization alone should have terrified him. A month ago, Blackthorne was the center of his universe. The estate, the power, the institutional legacy of a family that had survived centuries through ruthlessness and patience. He had sacrificed every human connection, every personal desire, every impulse that did not serve the architecture of his empire to preserve that legacy. It was his identity, his meaning, his reason for enduring the loneliness that came with being the most feared man in a kingdom full of frightened men. And now a woman he had known for less than a month had repositioned herself at the center of that universe, and the estate and the power and the legacy had become satellites orbiting around her presence the way moons orbited a planet, defined by her gravity, stabilized by her proximity, thrown into chaos by her removal. He sent 6 messages before noon. 2 to Greaves, confirming the emergency filing timeline. 1 to Lord Pennington, calling in the parliamentary favor with language precise enough to leave no room for interpretation. 1 to a newspaper editor who owed Lucien a debt significant enough to guarantee front-page placement. 1 to a banker in the city whose relationship with Wren's financial network Lucien had identified through Hale's preliminary intelligence. And 1 to a name he had not contacted in 3 years, a woman who operated in the deepest channels of London's information trade, who owed Lucien nothing and feared him slightly, and who possessed the one piece of intelligence that could end Cedric Wren's career overnight if deployed at the right moment. The message to the woman was simple. 4 words. I need the ledger. By evening, 3 of his 6 messages had received responses. Greaves confirmed the filing. Pennington confirmed his support. The newspaper editor confirmed placement. The banker did not respond. The woman did not respond. And at 9:17 in the evening, Morris entered Lucien's study with a face that looked like something had died behind it. Your Grace, a message from Mr. Hale. Lucien took the letter. Hale's handwriting was different this time, not hurried, careful. The deliberate penmanship of a man who knew the words he was writing would cause damage and wanted to ensure they were read correctly. The message was 3 sentences. The transfer was rerouted. Lady Serafina was taken to a private residence in Westminster, not to Crown custody. The order came from inside your operation. Lucien read it 3 times. The 3rd reading took longest because his vision was narrowing at the edges, a physiological response to a surge of adrenaline so intense that his body was preparing for a physical threat that did not exist in the room. Fight response without a target. The muscles in his forearms contracted. His breathing shifted from the shallow, efficient rhythm he maintained at rest to something deeper and harder, the respiratory pattern of an animal preparing to charge. Inside your operation, not Wren's people, not the Crown's bureaucracy, not some external force manipulating the system from outside. Inside. Someone inside Blackthorne. Someone inside the network of solicitors and investigators and allies Lucien had assembled over years of careful recruitment. Someone he trusted, which was a category so small it could be counted on one hand, had redirected the transfer to a private location outside legal oversight, where Wren could do whatever he wanted with Serafina without the protection of Crown custody rules. Lucien set the letter down. His hand was not shaking. The machinery did not permit shaking. But something deeper than his hand was vibrating at a frequency that felt like the low hum of a structure moments before collapse. The sound a building makes when the load-bearing wall finally cracks and the entire weight of everything above it begins to shift. Morris? Your Grace! Who knew the details of the transfer route, the exact timing, the specific escort formation, the destination? Morris's face, already pale, went a shade whiter. Yourself, Your Grace? Mr. Hale, Sir Philip Greaves, and... He stopped. Say it. Lord Pennington, Your Grace. You included the transfer details in your message requesting parliamentary support. Lord Alistair Pennington, the elderly peer who controlled a voting bloc, the man who owed Lucien a favor, the man Lucien had contacted that morning with enough operational detail to make the parliamentary request credible and specific, the man who had confirmed his support within hours. Too quickly. Lucian saw it now with the hideous clarity of hindsight, that particular form of vision that shows you every mistake you made while you were busy being brilliant. Pennington had responded too quickly. A man being asked to deploy significant political capital on behalf of a duke challenging a crown warrant should have deliberated, should have consulted his own advisors, should have at least paused long enough to weigh the risks. Instead, he had confirmed within hours, with the cheerful efficiency of a man who already knew the request was coming because someone had told him it would. Pennington had not been an ally waiting to be activated. He had been a channel, a funnel, a piece of plumbing connecting Lucien's operational intelligence directly to Cedric Wren's decision-making apparatus. Every piece of information Lucien had sent Pennington that morning, the transfer route, the timing, the legal strategy, the emergency filing timeline, all of it had been forwarded to Wren before lunch, and Wren had used it to reroute Serafina to a private location where Lucien's legal protections could not reach. The understanding arrived in Lucien's body before it arrived in his mind. His stomach contracted first, then his chest, then the muscles across his shoulders, tightening into cables beneath his shirt, as the full architecture of the betrayal assembled itself in his consciousness, with the mechanical inevitability of a trap revealing its design only after it had closed. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a better strategy, by his own information, his own network, his own trust, which he had distributed so sparingly and so carefully over so many years that the betrayal of even one node in the system felt like a structural failure of the entire thing. Because it was. The system worked only if every component was reliable, and the discovery that one component had been compromised meant every decision routed through that component was potentially contaminated. Every alliance Pennington had brokered, every political maneuver Pennington had facilitated, every piece of intelligence Pennington had received, and every response he had provided over the last 3 years since Lucien had brought him into the inner circle. 3 years. Wren had been inside Lucien's network for 3 years, and Lucien had not seen it. The thought detonated inside his skull like a charge placed at the foundation of a building. Not because the failure was strategic. Strategic failures could be corrected. This failure was epistemological. It attacked the fundamental mechanism by which Lucien evaluated reality. He trusted his judgment. His judgment was the instrument through which every decision flowed, the lens through which he assessed threats and allies, and the infinitely complex landscape of human motivation. That lens had failed. The instrument was flawed. And if the instrument was flawed, then every reading it had produced was suspect, every conclusion was questionable, every certainty was provisional. He was not just outmaneuvered, he was blind. And somewhere in a private residence in Westminster, Serafina was paying the price for his blindness. Lucien picked up the letter from Hale and held it over the candle flame on his desk. He watched it burn. The paper curled and blackened, and the words disappeared into ash and heat. And when the last fragment fell from his fingers, he looked at Morris with eyes that the old steward would later describe to Mrs. Blackwood in a whispered conversation in the kitchen as the eyes of a man who had just watched something inside himself die and had already decided what would grow in its place. "Prepare my horse," Lucien said. "I ride to London tonight." "Your Grace, the roads are—" "Prepare my horse, Morris. The Crown warrant is still active. If you are seen in London, if Wren's people identify you—" "I said prepare my horse." Morris fell silent. In 23 years he had heard Lucien give orders in every register of human authority. Cold command, quiet menace. The calculated warmth of a man managing subordinates he valued. This was none of those. This was the voice of a man who had passed through calculation entirely and emerged on the other side into a territory where decisions were no longer weighed against consequences because the consequences had already become irrelevant. Morris left to prepare the horse. Lucien opened the locked drawer of his desk. Inside were the Ashcombe documents, Wren's original letter, Hale's intelligence reports, and a sealed envelope he had placed there 6 years ago and never opened. The envelope contained a complete record of Lord Alistair Pennington's involvement in a financial scandal from 1815 that had been quietly buried by mutual agreement. Lucien had kept it as insurance, the standard practice of a man who understood that every alliance was temporary and every ally was a potential adversary. He had never used it because he had never needed to, because he had trusted Pennington, not with warmth, not with affection, with the cold, contractual trust of a man who believed that mutual leverage was a stable foundation for cooperation. He had been wrong. Trust was not a contract. Trust was a wager. And like all wagers, it could be lost by people who calculated the odds perfectly and still did not account for the one variable that no mathematics could predict: human nature. Lucian took the envelope, the intelligence reports, and a leather case containing documents he had prepared for a scenario he had hoped would never materialize, and he descended the tower staircase for the last time as the man he had been. The ride to London would take 2 days if he pushed the horse. He would push the horse, and during those 2 days, the Duke of Blackthorne would undergo a transformation that no one who had known him would fully understand until it was too late. Because the man who left Blackthorne that night was a strategist, a controller, a man who operated within systems and manipulated their mechanisms with surgical precision, a man who believed that power was architecture, and architecture was predictable, and predictability was survival. That man died on the road to London somewhere between the second river crossing and the dawn of the second day, killed not by a blade or a rival, but by the simple, devastating recognition that the system he had mastered was not a mechanism at all. It was a living thing, and living things betrayed you. The man who arrived in London 31 hours later, mud-covered and hollow-eyed and radiating a frequency of intent that made his own guard step back when he dismounted, was not a strategist. He was something older, something the aristocracy had not seen in generations because the modern world had taught powerful men to hide it beneath manners and procedure and the civilized veneer of institutional behavior. Lucien Vale walked into his London townhouse and closed the door behind him and stood in the dark hallway and breathed. In, out, each breath stripping away a layer of the person he had constructed over 28 years of careful, methodical self-creation. The Duke, the strategist, the architect of controlled destruction. The man who believed that the right information deployed at the right moment could solve any problem without ever requiring him to put his own body in the path of the consequences. That man was a masterpiece of self-engineering, and he had failed. He had failed because he had designed himself to operate in a world where every variable could be predicted, and the one variable that mattered most, the one that involved a woman standing in his entrance hall with a bruised jaw and steady eyes and a spine that refused to bend, was the one no design could accommodate. Serafina was not a variable. She was a person, and persons could not be managed by systems. They could only be protected by other persons willing to step outside the system entirely and accept the consequences. Lucien lit a single candle in his study. He sat at his desk. He opened the leather case and spread its contents across the wood surface, documents and maps and names and numbers arranged in the precise geometry of a final operation. Not a legal challenge, not a political maneuver, a siege. He would go to the private residence in Westminster where Wren was holding Serafina. He would go with Hale and whatever men Hale could assemble on 12 hours' notice. He would enter the building. He would remove her. And he would do it under his own name, in plain sight, without legal authority and without the protection of any institution he had spent his career cultivating. The Crown would call it abduction. Wren would call it assault. Parliament would call it the final proof that the Duke of Blackthorne had lost his mind. And Lucian would call it the first honest thing he had ever done. Because honesty, he understood now, was not the absence of deception. It was the willingness to act without the shield of plausible deniability, to stand in front of your own choices without a proxy, without a solicitor, without the elaborate legal and political scaffolding that allowed powerful men to do terrible things while maintaining the fiction that their hands were clean. Lucien's hands would not be clean after this. They would never be clean again. And he found, sitting alone in the candlelit dark of a townhouse that contained no personal history and no warmth, that he did not care. He pulled a blank sheet of paper toward him and began to write. Not a legal document, not a strategic memorandum. A letter. To Serafina. In case the operation failed and she never heard from him what he should have said before she left Blackthorne. The letter was 4 lines long. He sealed it. He placed it in the locked drawer with the documents he no longer needed, because the man who had assembled them no longer existed. Then Lucien Vale, the Duke of Blackthorne, the most feared man in England, blew out the candle and sat in total darkness and waited for dawn. When it came, he would walk into the fire, and whatever walked out the other side would be something entirely new. Dawn came gray and cold, and Lucien was already moving. He had not slept. Sleep was a biological function that required a nervous system at rest, and nothing inside Lucien Vale had been at rest since Hale's message arrived 18 hours ago. His body operated now on something more primitive than alertness, a state beyond exhaustion where the muscles stopped complaining and the mind stopped negotiating, and the entire organism simply ran on whatever fuel remained in the furnace because stopping was not a category the system recognized anymore. Hale was waiting in the townhouse kitchen. He had arrived at 4 in the morning with 2 men Lucien did not recognize, hard-faced and quiet, dressed in the nondescript clothing of laborers who would attract no attention on London streets. Hale introduced them only as Barrett and Sims, former military, currently loyal to no institution, which made them reliable in the specific way that men without allegiance were reliable. They could not betray a cause because they served none. They served money, and Lucien had money. "The residence is on Curzon Street," Hale said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table. "Private house, 3 floors. Wren purchased it under a shell name 2 years ago. He uses it for meetings that do not appear in any diary. Discreet entrance on the side alley, rear garden with a wall approximately 8 feet high backing onto a mews." "How many men inside?" "6 that I have confirmed, possibly 8. Wren keeps a rotating guard. These are not crown men. They are private, hired muscle, ex-soldiers, dock workers, the kind of men who break things for a living and do not ask why." "Armed?" "Assume yes." Lucien studied the map. The house was a box, one way in through the front, one through the side, one through the rear garden. Each entrance was a bottleneck, and bottlenecks were where people died. In a military operation, the solution was overwhelming force. Lucien did not have overwhelming force. He had 4 men, including himself, and a hand-drawn map on a kitchen table stained with coffee rings. Where is she being held? Upper floor, 2nd or 3rd. Hale's informant at the house, a kitchen maid Wren's people hired locally, confirmed a woman was brought in yesterday evening and taken upstairs. She has not been seen since. Lucien's fingers stopped on the map. The pause lasted half a second. In that half second, something happened behind his eyes that Hale had seen only once before, years ago, during an operation that had gone wrong in a way neither of them discussed afterward. A compression. A gathering of force behind the pupils like light concentrating through a lens until it reached a point hot enough to burn through whatever it touched. Time. Best window is between 6 and 7 this morning. Guard rotation shifts at 6. The overnight men are tired. The morning replacements will not arrive for at least 40 minutes. In that gap, we have reduced numbers and reduced alertness. Lucien looked at the window. The sky was lightening from black to charcoal. 5:30. 30 minutes. Weapons. Hale produced a canvas bag from beneath the table. Inside were 4 short-barreled pistols, a set of heavy iron lockpicks, and 3 knives of the kind that were designed for function rather than display, utilitarian blades meant for close work in tight spaces where elegance was irrelevant and speed was everything. Lucien picked up one of the pistols, checked the mechanism, loaded it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to shoot at 14 under the instruction of a gamekeeper who believed that aristocrats should be as comfortable with firearms as they were with forks. The weight of the weapon in his hand felt like a sentence being pronounced, a line being crossed. Everything on this side of the next 30 minutes was the life he had built. Everything on the other side was unknown territory where the Duke of Blackthorne did not exist, and only Lucien Vale remained, stripped of title and strategy and the elaborate architecture of institutional power, reduced to the fundamental question that every man eventually faced if he lived long enough and honestly enough. "What are you willing to lose?" He set the pistol in his coat. "We go through the rear garden, over the wall, in through the back entrance. Barrett and Sims take the ground floor. Neutralize anyone they find. No killing unless necessary. Hale, you are with me. We go up. And if we encounter more than we expect, then we move faster." Hale nodded. Barrett and Sims said nothing. They were the kind of men who communicated through action rather than language, and the absence of questions was its own form of confirmation. The 4 of them left the townhouse at 5:45. London at that hour was a ghost of itself. Fog hung in the streets like gauze wrapping a wound, thick enough to blur the gas lamps into smeared orange halos, but thin enough that shapes moved through it with the disturbing clarity of figures in a fever dream. Their boots were quiet on the cobblestones. 4 men walking in silence through a sleeping city toward an act that would either save a woman or destroy the man attempting it. Curzon Street was 10 minutes away. They covered it in 8. The house was exactly as Hale described. Georgian facade, dark windows. The side alley was narrow and smelled like horse dung and rotting produce from a nearby market. The rear wall was brick, 8 feet, topped with broken glass that someone had cemented into the mortar in a crude but effective deterrent. Barrett produced a heavy leather pad from inside his coat and laid it over the glass. He went over first with the ease of a man whose body remembered walls from a previous life. Sims followed, then Hale, then Lucian. The garden was small and neglected. Dead plants in clay pots. A stone path leading to a back door with a single lamp burning above it, casting a weak circle of light that made the darkness beyond it seem denser. Lucian's boots touched the ground, and the impact traveled up through his legs into his spine and settled in his chest where his heart was beating at a rate that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the knowledge that Serafina was somewhere above him, inside the dark mass of this building, and the distance between them was now measured in walls and stairwells and the bodies of men he was prepared to go through. The back door was locked. Hale's lockpick solved that in under a minute. The click of the mechanism sounded enormous in the pre-dawn silence, a tiny metallic detonation that Lucian felt in his teeth. They entered. The interior was dark, warm. The stale warmth of a closed house where windows had not been opened and air had been breathed and rebreathed by too many bodies in too little space. A hallway stretched ahead, narrow, with doors on either side. At the far end, a staircase rose into darkness. Barrett and Sims peeled off to the left. Lucian heard a door open, the scuff of boots on wood, and then a muffled impact followed by a sound like a heavy sack being dropped on the floor. Then silence. Barrett appeared at the end of the hallway and held up one finger, one down. Lucian and Hale moved toward the staircase. They were 4 steps up when the second guard found them. He came from a room on the right side of the ground floor, drawn by some sound or instinct, or the simple bad luck of a man who chose the wrong moment to visit the kitchen. He was large, broad across the shoulders in the way of men whose bulk came from labor rather than exercise. He saw Lucian and Hale on the stairs, and his mouth opened to shout, and Hale closed the distance in 2 strides and drove his fist into the man's throat with a precision that came from training so deep it had become reflex. The guard went down, making a sound like air escaping a punctured bellows. Hale caught him before he hit the floor and lowered him with the controlled efficiency of a man handling dead weight in a space where noise was fatal. Lucian did not stop. He was already moving up the stairs, each step taken with the balls of his feet to minimize sound, his pistol drawn, his breathing locked into the shallow, rhythmic pattern that kept his hands steady and his vision clear. The staircase turned once and opened onto a second-floor landing. 3 doors, all closed, no light beneath any of them. Hale reached the landing behind him and pointed to the far end. A 4th door, slightly ajar, with the faintest thread of candlelight visible through the gap. They moved down the hallway. Each step felt like a year compressed into a fraction of a second. Time had become unreliable, stretching and compressing around the gravity of what was about to happen. And Lucien existed inside that distortion the way a man exists inside the eye of a storm, surrounded by chaos but occupying a pocket of absolute stillness, where the only thing that mattered was the next step and the next breath, and the door getting closer with each one. He reached the door, pressed his palm flat against the wood, felt nothing. No vibration, no sound. Just the cool grain of painted pine and the thread of candlelight slicing across his knuckles like a blade made of gold. He pushed the door open. The room was small. A bedroom converted into a holding space. 1 window curtained, 1 candle burning on a table beside a narrow bed, 2 chairs. In 1 chair sat a guard, slumped and dozing with a pistol in his lap, his chin on his chest and his breathing heavy with the thick rhythm of a man who had been awake too long and lost the battle against his own biology. In the other chair sat Serafina. She was not restrained, no ropes, no chains. She sat upright with her hands in her lap, and her eyes open and her face turned toward the door. And when Lucien appeared in the doorway, she did not flinch, did not gasp, did not show surprise. She looked at him the way someone looks at a sunrise they were told would never come. Not with shock, with confirmation, like she had known he would be there, like she had been waiting. The guard stirred. Some animal sense penetrated the fog of exhaustion, the presence of a threat registering in the primitive circuitry that kept men alive even when their conscious minds had shut down. His hand twitched toward the pistol in his lap. Hale moved. The impact was surgical. Hale's hand closed around the guard's wrist and twisted. The pistol clattered to the floor. Hale's other arm wrapped around the man's neck from behind and compressed. 3 seconds. 4. The guard's body went limp. Hale lowered him to the ground with the same controlled silence he had applied downstairs and kicked the fallen pistol under the bed. Lucien crossed the room. He crouched in front of Serafina's chair and looked up at her face. In the candlelight, she looked the way people look after bad dreams. Not damaged, altered. The lines of her face were the same, but the topography behind them had shifted. New depths carved by 36 hours of captivity in a room where the only company was a sleeping guard, and the knowledge that the system designed to protect her had been turned into the instrument of her imprisonment. Her lip was split, fresh. A thin dark line on the left side of her lower lip that had bled recently and dried into a crust that she had not wiped away. Lucien's gaze locked onto that split lip with an intensity that had weight, that had mass, that had the specific gravity of something being added to a ledger that would never be balanced by anything less than the complete destruction of the man responsible. "Can you walk?" Lucien said. "I can run." Her voice was hoarse, roughened by hours of breathing dry air in a closed room. But underneath the roughness was the same steel cable that had run through every word she had spoken since the night she arrived at Blackthorne. Unbroken. Bent, compressed, tested to its limit, but unbroken. He took her hand. She stood. Her legs held. "How many more?" she asked. "On this floor, that one. Downstairs, Barrett and Sims are handling it. Hale has the route. The front door is chained from inside. I heard them chain it when they brought me in. We go out the way we came in, rear garden, over the wall." She nodded, no hesitation. No time wasted on the emotional infrastructure of rescue and relief that would have consumed minutes they did not have. She filed the information, processed the implications, and moved. They descended the stairs together, Hale in front, Serafina in the middle, Lucien behind, his pistol covering the upward staircase because threat came from above and behind, and the instinct to protect her had repositioned itself from an emotional impulse to a tactical orientation, his body physically placing itself between her and the direction of greatest danger without conscious instruction. The ground floor was clear. Barrett stood near the back entrance holding a pistol in each hand with the relaxed posture of a man who had already used at least one of them. Sims was behind him, dragging an unconscious guard into a side room by his ankles. The hallway smelled like sweat and the faint iron tang of blood, someone else's blood, visible in a smear across Barrett's right knuckles. "3 down, Barrett said. 4th went out the front, on foot, running." Lucien's chest tightened. A guard had escaped. Running. To raise alarm, to find reinforcements, to carry the specific devastating message that the Duke of Blackthorne had broken into a private residence on Curzon Street and physically removed a woman held under disputed legal custody. The clock had started. "Move. Now." They went through the back door into the garden. The sky had brightened from charcoal to ash. The fog was thinning. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang 6 times, each stroke vibrating through the cold air like a pulse counting down toward something final. Barrett went over the wall first. Then Sims. Then Serafina, boosted by Hale with a strength that did not match his lean frame, her hands gripping the leather pad on top and her body hauling itself over with a grim athleticism that spoke of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated and had stopped caring about the expectations of others long before she had stopped caring about their approval. Lucien went last. He was halfway over the wall when the front door of the house crashed open and 3 voices erupted into the morning air behind him, shouting in the coarse, abbreviated language of men who had been woken to violence and were running on adrenaline and fury. He dropped into the alley. The impact jarred his knees. His pistol was in his hand before his feet fully settled, and he was running before his mind finished calculating the distance between the alley mouth and the nearest intersection. They ran, 4 men and a woman moving through the waking streets of London, at a pace that drew stares from the early risers, the bakers and servants and delivery men who populated the city at this hour, and who watched the group pass with the instinctive wariness of people who recognize trouble in the particular way 5 bodies move together. Tight, fast, coordinated. Not the scattered run of thieves, but the organized withdrawal of people who had done something deliberate and were now managing the consequences. Hale navigated. He led them through a warren of side streets and alley cuts that turned Mayfair's elegant grid into a labyrinth designed to shed pursuit. Left, right, through a stable yard where horses startled at their passage. Down a cobblestone lane so narrow their shoulders brushed the walls on either side. Across a small square where a fountain stood dry and dead in the winter cold, and pigeons scattered from their path like gray detonations. They stopped in a courtyard behind a pub on a street Lucian did not recognize. Hale pressed his back against the wall and listened. Barrett watched the alley mouth. Sims covered the opposite direction. Lucian stood in the center of the courtyard with his hand still locked around Seraphina's and his heart pounding against his ribs with a rhythm that felt less like a heartbeat and more like something trying to break out from inside. Silence. 1 minute, 2. No pursuit. Hale exhaled. We are clear, for now. For now means nothing. Wren will have men on every major road within the hour. The townhouse is compromised. I have a location, south of the river, Bermondsey. A warehouse Wren does not know about because it does not exist on any record connected to your name. How do we get there? River. I have a boat at Whitehall Stairs. It is faster than the streets and harder to track. Lucian looked at Seraphina. She was breathing hard but controlled, the way runners breathe, athletes, soldiers, people whose bodies knew how to manage oxygen under stress because stress was not an exception, but a baseline. Her split lip had opened again during the run. A thin line of blood traced from the corner of her mouth down her chin. She did not wipe it. Are you hurt? He asked. Beyond the lip. Nothing that stops me from moving. That is not what I asked. It is the only answer that matters right now. She was right. The inventory of damage could wait. The immediate problem was extraction, and extraction required movement, and movement required a body that functioned regardless of what had been done to it. Everything else was a conversation for after, if there was an after. They moved again. South through streets that grew narrower and dirtier as Mayfair's polished facades gave way to the working districts that bordered the river. The fog thickened near the water, swallowing the city's edges and turning the Thames into a flat gray expanse that looked more like a void than a river, a gap in the world where London simply stopped and something else began. Whitehall Stairs were slick with river slime. A small boat waited at the bottom, tied to an iron ring, rocking gently in the current. Hale climbed in first and steadied it while the others descended. The boat took their weight with a groan that sounded like protest. 5 bodies, plus weapons, plus the collective tension of people who had just committed acts that would reshape their lives, whether they succeeded or failed. Hale took the oars. The boat pulled away from the stairs and entered the current, and London slid past on either side like a diorama being slowly drawn closed. Lucian sat at the stern with his arm around Seraphina. Not a conscious decision. His body had simply arranged itself around her the way a wall arranges itself around the thing it was built to protect. And the contact, the pressure of her shoulder against his chest, and the weight of her body leaning into his as the boat rocked on the river's surface, produced a sensation in his nervous system that he could not classify using any vocabulary he possessed. Relief was too simple. Joy was too clean. What he felt was closer to the sensation of a man who had been holding his breath underwater for minutes and had finally broken the surface and filled his lungs with air and was simultaneously experiencing the ecstasy of oxygen and the full-body agony of how long he had been without it. "You came," she said. Her voice was quiet. Beneath the hoarseness, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the blood drying on her chin, there was something he had never heard in her voice before. Wonder. Not the wonder of someone surprised. The wonder of someone who had tested a hypothesis against the cruelest possible conditions and found it confirmed. She had believed he would come. She had sat in that room with a sleeping guard and a split lip and no guarantee that anyone in the world cared enough to walk into a trap for her, and she had believed. And he had. "I told you I would," Lucien said. "Men tell women many things. I am not men, I am me. And I do not say things I do not mean because the effort of lying is greater than the effort of simply doing what I said I would do." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The contact was small, a woman's head resting against a man's shoulder in a boat on a gray river in the early morning of a day that would change everything. But Lucien felt it through every layer of his being, through coat and shirt and skin and muscle and bone and whatever existed beneath bone in the architecture of a person, the deep structure that held everything else up and that had been cracking slowly since the night she arrived, and that was now, finally, not cracking anymore. It was rebuilding, around her. The boat moved through the fog. Behind them, London stirred awake. The city would learn what had happened within hours. The news would spread through drawing rooms and Parliament and the Crown's administrative offices with the speed of all information that involved power and scandal and the specific, irresistible drama of a duke who had broken into a house and stolen back the woman he was not yet legally permitted to call his own. Wren would respond. The Crown would respond. Every ally and enemy Lucien had accumulated over a decade of political warfare would be forced to choose a side, and most of them would choose the side that appeared to be winning, which meant Lucien needed to ensure that when the dust settled, he was the one standing. But that was strategy. And strategy belonged to the man he had been before he rode through the night and climbed a wall and walked into a candlelit room and found Seraphina waiting for him with blood on her lip, and the unbroken certainty of a woman who had wagered everything on the conviction that one person in the world would not let her down. The man he was now operated on something simpler, necessity, not the necessity of politics or power or institutional survival, the necessity of a man who had discovered, at 28, after a lifetime of controlled isolation, that there existed in the world one person whose safety mattered more than his own, one person whose pain registered in his body as if it were his own. One person who, if removed from his life, would leave not a gap but a void, an absence so total that everything around it would collapse inward like matter falling into a darkness that had no floor. The boat reached the south bank. Bermondsey. Hale's warehouse was a brick structure on a narrow lane near the river, unmarked, unremarkable, the kind of building that existed in cities by the thousands, and that no one noticed because noticing it would require caring about it, and no one cared about Bermondsey. They entered through a side door. The interior was bare, wooden floors, high windows clouded with grime, a single room on the ground floor containing a table, 4 chairs, and a cast-iron stove that Hale lit with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had used this space before for purposes he did not advertise. Seraphina sat in one of the chairs, and finally, for the first time since Lucien had found her in the Curzon Street room, allowed something in her posture to release, not collapse, not the dramatic dissolution of tension that looked like weakness. A controlled exhale, the slight forward curve of the spine that occurred when a body that had been braced for impact finally accepted that the impact was not coming, at least not yet. Lucien crouched in front of her. He took her face in both hands gently, the way a man handles something he knows is stronger than it looks but refuses to test, and he tilted her head to examine the split lip. The cut was shallow. It would heal without scarring, but the fact of it, the evidence that someone had struck her face while she was in their custody, produced a reaction in Lucien's nervous system that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the primal, unstrategic, completely irrational fury of a man looking at damage done to someone he could no longer pretend he did not love. Who did this? One of the guards. When I refused to sign a document Wren sent. What document? A voluntary relinquishment of the betrothal agreement. Wren wanted my signature renouncing the engagement so he could present it to the Crown as proof that the arrangement was fraudulent. And you refused. I told the guard to inform Lord Wren that my signature was not available for purchase, and that if he wanted to dissolve a betrothal to a duke, he could discuss it with the duke personally. Lucien stared at her. The candlelight in the Curzon Street room, the split lip, the guard with the pistol. She had been alone, captive, without legal protection, without physical power, without any weapon except language, and she had used that language to tell Cedric Wren to go to the Duke himself. "You are insane," Lucian said. "I learned from the best. I am going to destroy Cedric Wren." "I know. Not politically, not financially. I am going to stand in front of him, and I am going to end him." "I know that too. It will cost everything. You already paid everything when you climbed that wall." She put her hand on his. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly with the residual vibration of adrenaline leaving the body, the chemical aftermath of sustained terror metabolizing through flesh and nerve. He closed his hand around hers and held on, and the contact was not romantic, not gentle, not the tender clasp of lovers in a drawing room. It was the grip of two people holding each other above a chasm, each one simultaneously the anchor and the weight, each one keeping the other from falling through the force of refusing to let go. "Hale," Lucian said without releasing her hand. "Timeline." Hale was standing near the window, watching the lane outside with the patient vigilance of a man who understood that safety was temporary and preparation was the only response to uncertainty. "Wren will know within hours that you took her. He will go to the Crown. The warrant for your arrest will be issued by noon. After that, every constable and enforcement officer in London will be looking for you." "How long before they look here?" "This location is clean. No connection to your name, 48 hours. Maybe 72. That is enough." "Enough for what?" Lucier stood. He walked to the table and spread the documents he had carried from the townhouse. The consolidated intelligence from Hale's investigation, Serafina's testimony about her brother's recruitment, the financial records showing Wren's shadow operations, the forged Ashcombe documents, and the sealed envelope containing Pennington's scandal, the leverage Lucien had kept for insurance, and that now served a different purpose entirely. Enough to bring Parliament into it, not through Pennington, through the evidence itself. We go directly to the opposition members who have been trying to investigate Treasury corruption for years and have been blocked at every turn by Wren's allies. We give them everything: the financial records, the forged documents, Serafina's testimony, Hale's intelligence, all of it. "That exposes your entire operation," Hale said. "Every method, every source, every piece of leverage you have accumulated. Once it is in Parliament's hands, it is public. You cannot control it." "I know. You built that operation over a decade." "I know. And you will burn it in a day." Lucian looked at Serafina. She was watching him from the chair with the same steady, diagnostic gaze she had turned on him the night she arrived at Blackthorne. The gaze that measured, the gaze that calculated, the gaze that decided what a man was worth before he had the chance to present his own estimate. "Some things," Lucian said, "are worth more than what I built." Hale held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded once, the way soldiers nod when an order has been given that they understand they will not survive unchanged. "I will make contact with Sir Robert Marsh. He chairs the Treasury Oversight Committee. If anyone in Parliament has the authority and the willingness to act, it is Marsh." "How fast?" "Tonight, if he agrees to meet." "He will agree. Tell him the Duke of Blackthorne is offering the evidence that will bring down the Crown's most protected corruption network. That is not an offer any ambitious politician refuses." Hale departed. Barrett and Sims took positions outside, and Lucien Vale stood alone in a warehouse in Bermondsey with the documents of his life's work spread across a table and the woman he had burned his empire to protect sitting 3 feet away. And he understood with total clarity that the next 24 hours would determine whether he emerged from this as a duke or a prisoner. The odds were not in his favor. They had never been in his favor. The difference was that now for the first time, the calculation did not matter. A man with everything to lose played the odds. He measured risk against reward, weighed probability against consequence, and chose the path most likely to preserve the structure he had spent his life constructing. A man with nothing to lose played differently. He played to win. Not because winning was probable, but because losing was unacceptable. And in the gap between those two positions existed a kind of freedom that terrified the men who still had something to protect. The freedom of total commitment. The freedom of a person who had already paid the maximum price and discovered that the payment, however devastating, had purchased something the marketplace of strategy and calculation could never provide. Clarity. Lucian knew exactly what he wanted, exactly what he would sacrifice, exactly how far he would go. There were no contingencies left, no fallback positions, no elegant legal maneuvers or political machinations waiting in reserve. There was only the evidence on the table, the woman in the chair, and the man standing between them and whatever the next dawn brought. Outside the warehouse, London continued waking. Somewhere in Westminster, Cedric Wren was learning that his prisoner was gone. Somewhere in Whitehall, Crown officials were drafting warrants. Somewhere in Parliament, the machinery of institutional power was grinding through its morning routines, unaware that by nightfall, a man with nothing left to lose would walk into its chambers and burn the corruption out of it with evidence purchased at the cost of everything he had ever built. And in a warehouse in Bermondsey, Lucian Vale sat down across from Seraphina Ashcombe and began organizing the documents that would either save them or bury them. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers measuring each other across a marble entrance hall. It was the silence of two people who had passed through the worst version of their shared reality and arrived on the other side still breathing, still holding on, still refusing to let go. The hours passed. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became evening. Hale sent word. Marsh had agreed to meet. Midnight. A private location. Bring everything. Lucien sealed the documents into the leather case. He checked his pistol. He stood at the warehouse door and looked back at Seraphina one last time before stepping into the night. She was standing, not sitting, not resting, standing, the way she had stood in Blackthorne's entrance hall on the first night, the way she stood when the world tried to push her down and she answered by occupying more space, not less. "Come back," she said. 2 words. No please, no qualification. A command disguised as a request, disguised as a statement of expectation from a woman who had decided that the man walking out the door was hers, and that his return was not a hope, but a requirement. Lucy looked at her across the dim expanse of the warehouse and felt, for one blazing second, the full weight of what he was about to do. The risk, the exposure, the absolute vulnerability of walking into Parliament's shadow corridors, carrying evidence that could topple one of the most powerful men in England, while a warrant for his own arrest was active, and armed men were hunting him through the streets of London. "I always come back," he said, and he stepped into the dark. Behind him, the door closed. Ahead of him, London waited, enormous, hostile, full of men who wanted him destroyed and systems that wanted him silenced, and a warrant that wanted him in chains. And somewhere in that hostile enormity, in a private room where a man named Marsh waited to receive documents that would change the architecture of English power, the final act of the Duke of Blackthorne's war was about to begin. Not as a strategist, not as a politician, as a man who had nothing left except the truth and the will to use it. And that, Lucian knew as he disappeared into the fog, was the most dangerous thing in the world. The meeting with Sir Robert Marsh took place in the back room of a printing house on Fleet Street at 12 minutes past midnight. Lucian chose the location deliberately, a printing house, a place where words became permanent, where information stopped being whispered and started being recorded, distributed, made irreversible. The symbolism was not subtle, and Lucian did not intend it to be. Subtlety had served him for a decade. Subtlety had built Blackthorne into a fortress of quiet power and controlled destruction, and subtlety had failed to protect the one person who mattered because subtle men operated within systems, and the system itself had been rotted from the inside by men who understood that the best place to hide corruption was inside the machinery designed to prevent it. Marsh arrived alone. This surprised Lucian, who had expected at least a secretary or a legal advisor. But Marsh was a particular kind of politician, the kind who had survived 30 years in Parliament by understanding that the most dangerous meetings were the ones with the fewest witnesses, and that a man who brought advisors was a man who needed help thinking. He was 62. Thin, white-haired with the military posture of a man who had served in his youth and never lost the habit of standing like the ground owed him something. His eyes were sharp beneath heavy brows, and they fixed on Lucian with the assessment of a man who had been measuring other men's intentions for longer than Lucian had been alive. "You look terrible," Marsh said. "I have not slept in 3 days." "Then this had better be worth both our time." Because I do not meet fugitives at midnight for anything less than the rearrangement of power. Lucien opened the leather case on the table between them. He removed the documents one stack at a time, placing each one with the deliberate care of a man building something. Not a legal argument. A weapon. Lord Cedric Wren has been siphoning Crown funds through a network of shadow financial entities for at least 6 years. The total amount diverted exceeds £400,000. The money has been laundered through fraudulent debt instruments, forged transfer agreements, and the systematic exploitation of aristocratic families whose financial vulnerabilities were deliberately created and then weaponized to provide cover for the transfers. He placed the financial records in front of Marsh. The Ashcombe family was one such instrument. Lord Edmund Ashcombe was recruited through engineered gambling debts and used as an intermediary to facilitate introductions between Wren's operatives and Treasury officials. His sister, Lady Seraphina Ashcombe, was listed as collateral on forged documents bearing signatures she did not authorize, created for the purpose of establishing a legal chain that would connect the shadow financing network to legitimate aristocratic estates and make the money trail untraceable. He placed Seraphina's testimony and the forged documents on the table. Chancellor Whitmore issued a seizure warrant against Lady Seraphina at Wren's request. The warrant was not reviewed by the normal judicial process because Whitmore owes Wren £40,000 in personal gambling debts, a debt documented here. The warrant was used to remove Lady Seraphina from my custody and transport her to a private residence controlled by Wren, where she was held without legal oversight and subjected to coercion. He placed the intelligence from Hale's investigation on the table. Lord Alistair Pennington, a member of my own advisory network, has been operating as Wren's informant for at least 3 years. He provided Wren with operational intelligence about my legal strategy, which Wren used to reroute the transfer and bypass Crown custody protocols. He placed the Pennington file on the table. Then he stepped back and let Marsh read. The silence lasted 11 minutes. Lucien counted, not consciously. His body counted, the way bodies count heartbeats and breaths and the intervals between danger and response. Each minute was a unit of exposure. Each minute was a window during which armed men searching for him could narrow their search radius. And every second he spent standing in a printing house on Fleet Street was a second the net tightened. Marsh finished reading. He set the final page down with the careful precision of a man handling something that might detonate. "This is enough to bring formal charges," Marsh said. "I know. It is also enough to destroy your own position. Your methods of gathering this intelligence are not entirely legal. Your removal of Lady Seraphina from Crown custody is a criminal act regardless of the circumstances. And your association with men like Hale, whose operational methods I suspect I do not want to examine in detail, creates vulnerabilities that any competent defense attorney will exploit. I know. You are handing me a weapon that can be aimed in 2 directions, Your Grace, at Wren or at you. I am aware of the geometry." Marsh leaned back in his chair and studied Lucien with an expression the Duke had never seen directed at himself before. Not fear, not calculation, not the careful political assessment that every powerful man applied to every interaction with every other powerful man. Something simpler, something almost human. Respect. Not the respect of a subordinate for a superior, not the respect of an inferior for a more powerful adversary. The respect of one old combatant for a younger one who had just made a move that was either brilliant or suicidal, and who clearly did not care which. "Why are you doing this?" Marsh asked. It was the same question Hale had asked. The same question that had been asked in different forms by every person who had witnessed Lucien Vale make decisions in the last 3 weeks that contradicted every pattern of behavior he had established over a decade of ruthless, self-serving, architecturally perfect political operation. Lucien considered giving the strategic answer, the institutional answer, the answer about corruption and systemic failure and the long-term stability of England's financial infrastructure. Instead, he told the truth. Because a woman I care about was taken from my home by a corrupt system and held in a room where a man split her lip for refusing to sign away her autonomy. And because I discovered that everything I built, every alliance, every strategy, every mechanism of control I spent 10 years engineering was not enough to prevent that from happening. And because if my empire cannot protect one person from one corrupt man, then my empire is not worth preserving. Marsh was quiet for a long time. That he said finally, is either the most honest thing a duke has said in a century or the most effective manipulation I have ever witnessed. It is not manipulation. I know. That is what concerns me. Manipulation I understand. Honesty from a man like you is uncharted territory. Marsh stood. He gathered the documents with the institutional care of a man who understood that paper was power and power required protection. I will convene an emergency session of the Oversight Committee tomorrow morning. I will present this evidence under parliamentary privilege, which protects both of us from legal reprisal during the proceedings. Wren will be summoned. Whitmore will be summoned. If the evidence holds, and I believe it will, formal charges will follow within the week. And the warrant against me? Will be suspended pending investigation. I cannot guarantee it will be voided. You did break into a private residence and remove a woman from legal custody. The circumstances may justify the action, but the action itself remains a crime. I am not asking for absolution. Good, because I am not in a position to offer it. What I can offer is time. Time for the evidence to work. Time for Parliament to do what Parliament does when it is presented with corruption so blatant that ignoring it becomes more dangerous than confronting it. How much time? A week, perhaps 2. Do not leave London. Do not contact Wren. Do not do anything that gives your enemies ammunition they do not already have. And Seraphina? Lady Seraphina is your betrothed, Your Grace. Under the terms of the engagement, she is legally your responsibility. I would suggest keeping her somewhere safe and quiet and far from the attention of the press until this is resolved. Marsh tucked the documents inside his coat and walked to the door of the printing house. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at Lucien. For what it is worth, Your Grace, in 30 years of Parliament, I have watched men sacrifice others to protect their power. I have never watched a man sacrifice his power to protect another person. Whatever happens next, that distinction matters. Marsh left. The door closed. Lucy stood alone in the printing house with empty hands and the strange, weightless sensation of a man who has just let go of something he carried for so long that he had forgotten it was heavy until the weight was gone. He walked back to Bermondsey through streets that were dark and cold and empty and full of the particular silence that cities produce in the hours between midnight and dawn. The silence that is not absence of sound, but presence of potential. The held breath of a million sleeping lives about to wake into a day that would be different from the one before. Seraphina was asleep when he arrived. She had fallen asleep in the chair, which did not surprise him because Seraphina Ashcombe did not sleep in beds when she was in unfamiliar territory. Beds required trust. Chairs required only endurance. And endurance was the currency she had been spending her entire life. The one resource she possessed in unlimited supply because it was manufactured not by comfort, but by the sustained refusal to stop. Lucien did not wake her. He sat in the chair across from hers and watched her sleep in the amber light of the stove, and for the first time in longer than he could calculate, he allowed his body to do what it had been begging to do for 3 days. Rest. Not sleep. His mind would not permit sleep, but rest. The controlled reduction of vigilance from maximum to something slightly below maximum, a decrease so small that most people would not have recognized it as relaxation, but that for Lucien constituted a seismic shift in operational status. The muscles in his shoulders loosened by a fraction. His breathing deepened by a degree. His hands, which had been held in a state of readiness since the moment Hale's message arrived, opened slowly on his knees like fists that had forgotten they were fists and were tentatively remembering how to be hands. He watched her breathe. In, out, in, out. The rhythm of a person who had passed through the worst of it and come out the other side still intact, not undamaged. Intact. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. Damage was the evidence of impact. Intactness was the evidence of structure. You could damage something beyond recognition, and it could still be intact if the core held, if the thing that made it what it was survived the assault of everything trying to make it something else. Seraphina's core had held, and so Lucien realized with a quiet astonishment that felt like the first warmth of spring after a winter that had gone on so long he had forgotten other seasons existed, had his. The week that followed was the longest of Lucien's Lucien's life, measured not in hours but in the accumulating weight of uncertainty. Marsh convened the Oversight Committee on a Tuesday morning. The proceedings were closed to the public but open to every member of Parliament with sufficient clearance, which meant that within hours the corridors of Westminster were electric with the specific kind of energy that accompanied political detonation. Names were named, documents were presented. Evidence was examined with the forensic attention of men who understood that the information in front of them would reshape careers, destroy legacies, and redraw the invisible map of power that governed who mattered in England and who did not. Wren was summoned on Wednesday. He arrived with 4 lawyers and the compressed fury of a man who had spent 6 years building an empire of shadow finance and was now watching it dismantled in a committee room by men he had believed were either too cowardly or too compromised to touch him. He was wrong on both counts. The evidence was overwhelming, not because of any single document, but because of the cumulative architecture Lucien had assembled. Financial records corroborated by Hale's intelligence, corroborated by Serafina's testimony, corroborated by the forged signatures, corroborated by the paper trail connecting Wren to Whitmore to Pennington to the shadow network that had been feeding on Crown funds for half a decade. Each piece strengthened every other piece. The structure was interlocking, self-reinforcing. Designed by a man who understood that individual facts could be disputed, but systems of facts could not, because disputing the system required proving that every component was false simultaneously, and the probability of that decreased exponentially with each additional piece of evidence. Lucien had spent 10 years building that system, and he had spent one night handing it to a man he barely knew, on the faith that the system of governance he had spent his career manipulating was still capable, somewhere beneath the corruption and the compromise and the institutional cowardice, of doing what it was designed to do. By Thursday, 3 of Wren's financial entities had been frozen. By Friday, Chancellor Whitmore had resigned. By Saturday, Lord Alistair Pennington had been escorted from his London residence by Crown officers and transported to a holding facility where he would remain until formal charges were filed. Lucy received this news in the Bermondsey warehouse, delivered by Hale in fragments over the course of the week. Each fragment landed in the silence of the bare room like a stone dropped into still water, and Lucien absorbed each one with the careful attention of a man who understood that winning was not a single moment but a process, and processes could reverse themselves at any point if the conditions changed. But the conditions did not change. On Sunday, Cedric Wren was arrested. The news reached Lucien through Greaves, who arrived at the warehouse in person with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had spent 20 years practicing law and had just witnessed the legal system do something he had almost stopped believing it was capable of. Formal charges, Greaves said: embezzlement, fraud, corruption of Crown officials, forgery, unlawful detention. The list is extensive. The trial will take months, but the outcome is not in doubt. The evidence is simply too comprehensive. And the warrant against me? Suspended, indefinitely. Sir Robert Marsh has entered a statement into the parliamentary record characterizing your actions at the Curzon Street residence as emergency intervention on behalf of an unlawfully detained person. It is not a pardon. It is not an exoneration, but it is enough to ensure that no prosecutor will touch it. Not a pardon, Lucien repeated. No, Your Grace. You broke the law. The law recognizes that. But the law also recognizes that the custody you disrupted was itself unlawful, which creates a legal paradox that no court wants to adjudicate. The practical effect is the same as a pardon. The formal status is not. Lucien nodded. He understood. He had operated outside the law to correct a failure of the law, and the system's response was to acknowledge both the crime and its justification without resolving the contradiction between them. It was, in its way, the most honest thing the system had ever done. A refusal to pretend that justice was clean. An admission that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing occupied different territory, and that the distance between them was the space where real decisions happened. The engagement, Greaves continued. The Crown has no objection. Wren's challenge is void. Lady Serafina's legal status is clear. The forged documents have been entered into evidence as proof of fraud, which means her prior obligations are nullified. She is, in the eyes of the law, free. Free. The word landed in the room with a weight disproportionate to its size. 4 letters, 1 syllable. The distillation of everything Serafina Ashcombe had been denied since her brother signed her name on a document the day after her 21st birthday and converted her from a person into a transaction. Serafina was standing near the window when Greaves delivered this last piece of information. She had been standing there for most of the week, watching the street below with the same patient vigilance Lucien applied to coastlines and horizons, scanning for threats that might materialize from the gray London landscape. She heard the word free, and her hands, resting on the windowsill, went still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of absorption. The way stone absorbs rain. Slowly. Completely. Without visible change on the surface, but with a fundamental alteration in the weight of the thing itself. She did not turn around. Greaves departed. Hale, Barrett, and Sims had already been dismissed to their respective shadows. The warehouse was empty except for two people and the silence between them, which had evolved over the past week from companionable to communicative to something that functioned as a language of its own, carrying meaning in the spaces between breaths, the way music carried meaning in the spaces between notes. "You are free," Lucien said. Serafina turned from the window. In the pale morning light filtering through the grime-clouded glass, she looked like something that had been through a furnace and emerged not purified, but tempered. Harder at the edges, clearer at the center. Her split lip had healed to a thin line that would fade to nothing within weeks. Her eyes, dark and steady, held the particular luminosity of a person who had been looking at the world through the lens of survival for so long that the removal of the lens revealed colors she had forgotten existed. "Free," she repeated. "That word has never applied to me before. It applies now. Because you made it apply. Because you survived long enough for me to make it apply. The sequence matters, Serafina. I provided the mechanism. You provided the reason it was necessary. Without your testimony, without the fragments your brother told you, without the 2 weeks you spent teaching yourself estate law in my library, there would have been nothing to hand to Marsh. The evidence existed because you existed. Because you listened when men assumed you were not listening. Because you remembered when men assumed you would forget." She crossed the room. Slowly. Not with the rigid, armored walk she had maintained since the first night at Blackthorne. With something different. Something that moved through her body like the first thaw, the loosening of muscles that had been clenched for years, the gradual release of a posture designed to absorb impact, now recognizing, slowly and with immense caution, that the impact was not coming. She stopped in front of him. "What happens now?" she asked. It was the same question she had asked in the entrance hall. What am I it? The same structural inquiry of a woman who needed to understand the terms of her existence before she could inhabit it. But the quality of the question had changed. In the entrance hall, it had been defensive, a demand for clarity in a hostile environment. Here, now, in a bare warehouse on a gray morning after the storm had passed, it was something else. An invitation. "What happens now," Lucien said, "is that we return to Blackthorne. The estate needs rebuilding, not the walls. The walls are fine. The network, the alliances, the operational infrastructure I spent 10 years constructing and 1 night dismantling. Everything I handed to Marsh is public now. Every method, every source, every mechanism of leverage and intelligence that made Blackthorne what it was. I built an empire on information, and I gave the information away. Do you regret it?" The question was quiet, not loaded, not testing. Genuine curiosity from a woman who wanted to understand the internal landscape of a man she had chosen to trust, and who understood that trust required ongoing calibration, not a single act but a continuous process of assessment and adjustment, and the willingness to see clearly even when clarity was uncomfortable. Lucien considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret the necessity," he said. "I do not regret the choice. The empire I built was effective, but it was also brittle. It depended on secrecy, and secrecy is a structural weakness because it requires every component of the system to remain sealed, and sealed systems fail the moment a single seal breaks. Pennington was a broken seal, and the fact that one broken seal could compromise the entire structure meant the structure was flawed." He paused. "The thing I build next will be different." "Different how?" "I do not know yet. That is the honest answer. I have spent my entire adult life operating one way, and that way produced results, but also produced a man who trusted no one, connected with no one, and nearly lost the only person who ever mattered to him because his architecture of control could not accommodate the one variable that makes control impossible. What variable? Another person. A real one. Not a piece on a board. Not an asset or a liability or a node in an intelligence network. A person who argues in my library and steals my chair and reads my private correspondence and tells me to my face that I cannot destroy her because she has nothing left to lose. That person breaks every model I have ever built, and I have spent 3 weeks discovering that the broken model is better than the intact one. Serafina's hand rose to his face. Her fingers touched his jaw, tracing the line of bone beneath skin with the light, deliberate contact of a person who had been touched without consent too many times and had learned to make every touch she initiated an act of conscious choice. Her thumb brushed the thin scar along his left temple that most people never noticed. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "A monster. The stories about you in London society paint a very specific portrait. Cold, calculating. A man who destroys people the way other men breathe. When they told me I was being sent to Blackthorne, I expected to find a predator in a castle and to spend however long I survived there learning to be invisible. And instead, I found a man who gave me documents I did not ask for because he did not want me to live inside an arrangement I did not understand, who tracked my movements through his steward not because he wanted to control me, but because he did not know how to express concern in any language except surveillance, who knelt in front of me in a Bermondsey warehouse and examined a split lip with the focused intensity of a man who had already decided that whoever caused it would pay a price so severe that the payment itself would become a warning to every man who ever considered raising his hand against a woman in his protection. Her hand moved from his jaw to his chest, palm flat, over his heart. The same diagnostic gesture she had used before she left Blackthorne in the custody of armed men. Checking, confirming, feeling for the heartbeat that told her the man in front of her was real and present and not a construction designed to deceive. "Your heart is calm," she said. "For the first time in weeks." "Because it is over? Because you are here." The words came out without strategy, without construction, without the careful architectural planning he applied to every sentence he spoke, in every interaction with every person he had ever known. They came out the way breath comes out. Involuntary, necessary, the body doing what the body needed to do to keep the organism alive. Serafina looked up at him. The distance between their faces was measured in inches. In that small space, all the architecture of the past month, the entrance hall, the north library, the split lip, the wall, the river, the warehouse, compressed into a single moment that felt like the point where two separate lines of force, moving through the world on independent trajectories, finally intersected and discovered that the intersection was not a collision, but a convergence. "I'm going to kiss you," she said. "And I am telling you in advance because I do not do anything to anyone without their knowledge and consent. That is the difference between me and every person who has made decisions about my life without asking." Lucien almost smiled. Almost. The muscles engaged. The expression formed. And this time he did not stop it. He let it arrive on his face with the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a man performing an action he had almost forgotten was in his repertoire. It was not a large smile, not warm, not easy, not the practiced social gesture of a man comfortable with joy. It was small and sharp and slightly crooked, and it belonged entirely to him. And it was the most honest expression his face had produced in a decade. "Noted," he said. She kissed him. It was not gentle, not tentative, not the careful, exploratory contact of two people testing compatibility. It was a kiss that had been built by weeks of proximity and distance, of arguments in libraries and silences in corridors, of a hand held across a table covered in legal documents and a head resting against a shoulder in a boat on a gray river. It was a kiss that contained its own history, and that history was not romantic. It was structural. Two people who had each been alone for so long that aloneness had become their native state, discovering through sustained, agonizing, terrifying proximity that the native state could change, that it was already changing, that it had changed the moment she walked into his entrance hall and refused to sit down. When they separated, Lucien's hand was in her hair, and her fingers were gripping his coat, and the warehouse was silent except for their breathing and the distant sound of the Thames moving through its ancient channel beyond the walls, carrying the city's refuse and commerce and secrets toward the sea with the same indifferent persistence it had maintained for 1,000 years. "Blackthorne," she said. "Blackthorne," he agreed. They left London 3 days later, traveling north in a carriage that bore no crest, because Lucian had discovered that he no longer needed the world to know he was coming. The announcement of his presence had been a tool of intimidation, and intimidation was a mechanism of the old architecture, the sealed system that had failed. Whatever he built next would operate differently, not through secrecy and fear, but through something he did not yet have a name for, something that existed in the space between the man he had been and the man who had climbed a wall and crossed a river and handed his life's work to a stranger on the faith that the system could still be made to function. The ride took 2 days. They stopped once at an inn where the innkeeper recognized neither of them and served them food without deference or suspicion, and Lucian discovered that anonymity, which he had always considered a vulnerability, was actually a form of freedom. A duke could not eat a meal in an inn without the meal becoming a performance. A man could. They arrived at Blackthorne on a Thursday afternoon. The castle stood against the gray sky exactly as it always had. Black stone, tall towers, the cliffs below and the sea beyond, and the wind moving through the battlements with the low, constant moan that had been the soundtrack of Lucian's life since childhood. Nothing had changed about the building. Every stone was where he had left it. Every corridor maintained its marble silence. Every portrait of every dead Vale still stared down from its gilded frame with the same accumulated disapproval. But the man walking through the gates was not the man who had left. Morris met them in the courtyard. The old steward's face performed several complex operations in rapid succession, cycling through relief and exhaustion, and something that looked suspiciously like emotion before settling on the composed professional mask he had maintained for 23 years. He bowed. He welcomed Lady Seraphina home. He informed Lucienne that the household had been maintained in his absence and that the staff had taken the liberty of preparing the North Library with fresh firewood and tea. Lucian thanked him. Morris blinked. In 23 years of service, the Duke of Blackthorne had never thanked his steward for anything, operating on the principle that gratitude was redundant in a relationship defined by duty and compensation. The principle no longer held. Lucian walked through his castle with Seraphina beside him. Not behind him, not in front of him, beside him. The way they had stood on the morning they decided to build something together, neither leading nor following but moving in parallel through the corridors of a building that was older than either of them and would outlast them both, and that had witnessed, in its centuries of cold stone existence, more human drama than any theater could contain. They reached the North Library. The fire was lit. The tea was waiting, and the leather wingback chair sat beside the north window in the morning light, occupied by nothing except the memory of every conversation that had taken place in and around it over the past month. Seraphina sat down in it. Lucian took the smaller chair opposite. The arrangement was the same as it had been on the morning she stole his seat, and he had said nothing about it because something in her refusal to defer had activated a part of him he did not know existed. The same 2 chairs. The same fire, the same pale light through the same north-facing window, everything the same, everything different. "You're going to need to rebuild your network," Seraphina said. "I know. I can help. I know that too. I am better at this than you think. I think you are better at most things than most people think. That is your primary strategic advantage, and I am not foolish enough to underestimate it." She picked up her tea, held it in both hands. The warmth of the cup colored her fingers pink, and Lucian watched the color return to her skin with the irrational, unstrategic, completely indefensible satisfaction of a man who had discovered that the sight of another person warming their hands on a teacup in his library could produce a sensation more powerful than any victory he had ever engineered. This was not the life he had planned. The plan had been control, architecture, the systematic accumulation of power through information and leverage, building an empire so structurally sound that nothing could breach its walls, including the messy, unpredictable, uncontrollable reality of caring about another person. That plan had been clean, efficient, and it had produced a man who was feared by everyone and known by no one, who ruled from a fortress that kept the world out so effectively that it also kept him in, sealed inside his own design like an architect who had built a perfect building and then discovered he could not find the door. Serafina was the door. Not because she had broken through his defenses, because she had made him want to open them himself. A distinction that sounded subtle, but that contained in its narrow margin the entire difference between destruction and transformation. Between a wall that falls because it was attacked and a wall that opens because the person behind it decided that the world outside, with all its risk and damage and ungovernable chaos, was worth stepping into. The man who had left Blackthorne 3 weeks ago would not have understood that distinction. The man who sat in the smaller chair in the North Library, drinking tea across from a woman who had taught him more about strength in 1 month than he had learned in 28 years of wielding power, understood it completely. "Lucienne," Serafina said. He looked up. She was watching him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not guarded, not diagnostic, not the careful, measuring gaze of a woman assessing threat and calculating response. Open. The muscles around her eyes relaxed, her mouth soft. The architecture of defense that she had maintained since the first night, the posture, the armor, the controlled stillness that kept the world at a distance, had come down. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way ice melts in spring. Gradually. Naturally. As if the warmth had been building for weeks, and the structure had finally reached the point where it could no longer maintain itself against the accumulated temperature of safety and trust, and the slow, difficult, terrifying discovery that it was possible to be seen by another person and not be harmed by the seeing. "I am not going anywhere," she said. 3 words, spoken quietly, without drama, without declaration, without the elaborate emotional architecture that other women might have constructed around such a statement. A fact. Delivered with the same directness she had applied to every communication since the moment she arrived. "I am not going anywhere." A decision stated as a condition, a commitment delivered as information. Lucien set down his tea. "Neither am I," he said. Outside the North Library windows, the Northumbrian sky stretched gray and vast above the cliffs, and the sea moved against the rocks below with the patient, repetitive persistence of something that would never stop. The wind came through the battlements, and the castle groaned with the sound of ancient stones settling deeper into the earth it had occupied for 400 years. And inside the library, 2 people sat across from each other in a silence that was not empty, but full. So full it pressed against the walls and the windows and the vaulted ceiling with the quiet, enormous pressure of 2 lives that had collided and fused and would not be separated again by anything the world could produce. Lucien Vale, the Duke of Blackthorne, the most feared man in England, sat in the smaller chair in his own library and looked at the woman who had walked into his castle with 1 trunk and a bruised jaw and dismantled the most carefully constructed fortress in the kingdom without raising a single weapon. He was not the man he had been. He was not certain who he was becoming. But for the first time in his life, the uncertainty did not feel like a threat. It felt like the beginning. And somewhere beneath the roar of the northern sea and the wind howling through Blackthorne's ancient towers, the Duke who had once believed that power meant never needing anyone discovered the truth that had been waiting for him since the night a storm-soaked woman refused to sit in his entrance hall and looked him in the eye and asked him to name what she was. She was not a transaction. She was not a strategy. She was not a variable in an equation or a piece on a board or an asset to be managed by a man who thought control was the same as strength. She was the reason the strength existed at all, and he would spend the rest of his life making certain she never had cause to doubt it.